A woman went to buy a hairdryer. She never came home, and for 48 years, nobody knew why. This is not a story about a monster, not yet. This is a story about a Sunday afternoon, a newspaper ad, and one small decision that broke a family apart forever. This is the story of Wendy Jo Hallison. September 29, 1968. A Sunday afternoon in Los Angeles. Fairfax Avenue was busy the way it always was. Cars moving, stores open, nobody paying attention to anyone they did not have to. A perfectly ordinary day for everyone on that street. Everyone except one family. Wendy Hallison was 22 years old, a senior at San Fernando Valley State College, the school now called Cal State Northridge. She studied art. She was driven, warm, and genuinely happy with the direction her life was heading. She grew up in Los Angeles on Stearns Drive, south of Carthay Square. Her father, Lee, was a real estate salesman. Her mother, Kathleen, had been a bookkeeper before becoming a homemaker. They raised two daughters, Linda, the older one, and Wendy. The sisters grew up painting together and playing piano together, the kind of close that does not need explaining. Wendy had a smile that showed up in photos and still reached through them decades later. She had a boyfriend she cared about, a little poodle named Pierre who followed her around the house. She had, as her brother-in-law Gil Court would later recall, everything going for her. That morning, she spotted a newspaper ad, a hairdryer on sale at the thrifty drugstore on the corner of Wilshire Boulevard and Fairfax Avenue. A 10-minute drive, a simple errand. She called Linda. Did she want to come along? Linda had two young boys at home that Sunday. She said no. She wanted to spend the day with her family. It was the most ordinary decision a mother makes. It would haunt Linda for the rest of her life. So Wendy drove alone. She parked, walked into the thrifty, found the hairdryer, paid for it, and left. Then she pulled into a gas station just down the street and filled up her tank. A woman running errands on a Sunday afternoon, nothing unusual about any of it. That was the last time anyone saw Wendy Hallison alive. Whatever happened to her happened in the gap between that gas station and her front door, a stretch of road she had driven 100 times before. A Sunday afternoon, a city full of people in every direction, and nobody saw a thing. By evening, the Hallison house was too quiet in a way that felt wrong. Wendy was not the kind of person who went silent without a word. If her plans changed, she called. She was reliable in the way only people who truly love their family are reliable. When the hours passed and the phone stayed quiet, her family did not wonder whether something was wrong. They knew. Her mother, Kathleen, called the police and explained what had happened, that her daughter had left that afternoon to run a simple errand and had never come home, that this was completely out of character. The police told her to wait. They could not open a missing persons case this quickly, they said. She would probably turn up. Wendy did not turn up. The night passed slowly. Inside the Hallison home, no one slept. The family sat with a fear that had no clear shape yet, not knowing if Wendy was hurt, if she was lost, if she needed help, not knowing anything at all, just waiting for a phone that did not ring. All they could do was wait for morning and hope. What they would find the next morning would stay with every one of them for the rest of their lives. Monday morning arrived with the kind of fear that does not go away when the sun comes up. Wendy had been gone all night. No call, no message. The police were still not moving fast enough, so Gil Court moved instead. Gil was not just Wendy's brother-in-law. He was a private investigator. He understood that in a missing persons case, the early hours are everything. He made calls, organized a civilian search party, and hired a helicopter to sweep the neighborhood from above. Less than an hour into the search, Wendy's boyfriend was up in that helicopter, scanning the streets below. Fairfax Avenue stretched beneath them, a long corridor lined with hundreds of parked vehicles. Finding one specific car from that altitude, at that speed, was close to impossible. The boyfriend pointed down and said, "There, a green Ford Thunderbird parked on Fairfax near Olympic Boulevard, just south of the thrifty store." The helicopter pilot was stunned. He said later he had no idea how the boyfriend had spotted that specific car from that height. It was like finding a needle in a haystack, except the boyfriend had gone straight to it, almost without hesitation, as if he already knew exactly where to look. That detail would not go unnoticed by the detectives who heard about it. Gil came down to the car. He looked through the window. The keys were not in the ignition. They were lying on the floor of the back seat, as if dropped there in a hurry. He picked them up, walked to the back of the car, put the key in the trunk lock. He opened it. He would later say, simply, quietly, that it was the worst day of his life. There are no other words for it. Gil went back to the house. Linda was on the front porch watching the street, waiting the way people wait when they do not want to think about what the wait might mean. She saw Gil walking toward her, and she knew, not from his words, but from his face. In all the years she had been married to this man, she had never seen him cry. She was seeing it now. "We found her," he said. Linda's heart lifted, just for 1 second. "She's gone." And it broke completely. When detectives arrived and examined the scene, the evidence was clear on several things. Wendy's life had been taken forcefully, and the instrument used by the perpetrator was left behind at the scene. Signs at the scene indicated she had fought back bravely against her attacker, refusing to go quietly despite the element of surprise. Her watch and jewelry were still on her body. Robbery was ruled out immediately. This was not about money or valuables. Whoever did this to Wendy wanted something else entirely. Then, one small detail that nobody could explain: the hairdryer was missing. The only thing Wendy had gone out to buy that day, gone, never recovered. No reason ever found for why a killer would take it. That question has never been answered. Detectives moved quickly on suspects. Wendy had told Linda about her errand that morning, which meant someone either followed her from the store or already knew she would be out alone. That pointed toward people in her life. 4 men were brought in for questioning: her current boyfriend, an ex-boyfriend she had remained friendly with, her brother-in-law Gil Court, and a close male friend. Detectives reasoned that this type of personal assault is rarely random. It is often a crime that requires deliberate proximity and intent. This felt like someone who had targeted Wendy specifically and knew she would be alone. The investigation focused most heavily on the boyfriend and the ex-boyfriend. Both had a personal connection to Wendy. Both would have known her routines and habits, and both had reasons, in the detective's theory, to potentially want to harm her. That theory would hold for 30 years. It would also turn out to be completely wrong. All 4 men agreed to take polygraph tests. Gil passed immediately and was cleared as a focus within days. He understood the procedure. As a private investigator, he had always known this kind of scrutiny came with the territory. The boyfriend failed. A failed polygraph is not evidence of guilt. Courts do not accept polygraph results for exactly this reason. But combine that failure with the way he had spotted Wendy's car from the helicopter in a way that left the experienced pilot genuinely speechless, and the suspicion around him became very difficult to ignore. Detectives could not walk away from him. For a long time, they did not. Years later, when DNA evidence would clear him entirely, the weight of what he had been carrying would become impossible to fully describe. He had found Wendy, he had loved her, he had grieved her, and the entire time, the investigation had quietly treated him as a possible killer. That is not a burden that disappears just because someone eventually says you are innocent. But in 1968, none of that clarity existed. There was no physical evidence connecting him, or anyone else, to the crime. No arrest was made. Then came one more lead. A witness had seen a white man near Wendy at the thrifty store that afternoon. The same man was spotted again at the gas station just down the street. Both times Wendy was there. He had followed her from the store to the station without her noticing. But no one got a name. No one caught a plate number, no usable description, just the fact of his presence, and then his disappearance. A ghost. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. No arrests were ever made. No charges were ever filed. The case went cold. And somewhere out in that city, the man who had followed Wendy Hallison step by step on a Sunday afternoon was still walking free, and no one knew his name. If Wendy's story is gripping you, hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe for more deep dives. Want to uncover even more mysterious cold cases? Check out the curated playlist linked in the description below. Now back to the case. After the investigation stalled, the Hallison house changed in a way nobody put into words. Wendy's room stayed exactly as she had left it. Her clothes, her art supplies, her books, all untouched, all in the same place she had put them on the morning she drove away, as if the family was holding the space open, keeping it ready, just in case. It stayed that way for years. Her father, Lee, carried her absence in a way that had no off switch. Wendy had been born on his birthday, the same day, the same celebration. Every year when that date arrived, her absence sat right there at the table, not in the background, right there, in every candle, every quiet moment when the room felt one person short. He could not celebrate his own birthday without feeling, somewhere beneath everything, who was missing from it. He did not stop trying. He made regular trips to the local police station, asking if anything new had come in, asking if the technology had changed, asking if someone had remembered something. He offered rewards. He kept showing up year after year because showing up was the only form of fighting he had left. He almost always left without anything new. As Lee's health declined, he called Linda to his side and said the words that she would carry for the rest of her life. Don't forget your sister. Do what you think you can do to find out who did this. It was not a request. It was a promise he was asking her to keep in his place because he knew he was running out of time to keep it himself. Both Lee and Kathleen passed away without ever learning who killed their daughter. They had lived through the investigation, through the suspects, through the years of silence. They had held on to hope through all of it, and they died without the answer. Then, in 1998, 30 years after Wendy's murder, something shifted, and it started with a detective who refused to accept that this case would die with the people who first worked it. Detective Frank Boland went back to the evidence room and pulled Wendy's case files. He brought in LAPD criminalist Harry Klan Jr. and asked him to re-examine everything collected from the crime scene in 1968. The reason was a single word that had been quietly transforming law enforcement for years: DNA. At that point, the LAPD had only been using DNA forensics for about 4 years. But what the science promised was unlike anything before it. A genetic fingerprint left at a crime scene could survive for decades and still identify a killer. Science could now go back in time. Klan examined Wendy's preserved clothing from 1968. What his colleague found stopped everyone cold. Forensic specialists managed to isolate an unknown male genetic profile from the preserved clothing evidence. The killer had left behind his genetic signature. It had been sitting in an evidence room for 30 years, waiting for the science to catch up with it. And now it had. Detectives moved fast. Blood was drawn from all 4 original suspects, the same men who had been questioned in 1968, the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend, Gil Court, the male friend. Each sample was compared directly against the DNA from Wendy's clothing. Everyone connected to this case held their breath. The boyfriend had failed that polygraph in 1968 and had never fully escaped the cloud of suspicion. His name had remained in the conversation for 3 decades. Was this finally the moment it would all come together? The results came back. All 4 men were completely cleared. The boyfriend was innocent. Gil was innocent. Every single person who had been under suspicion for 30 years had no DNA connection whatsoever to what happened to Wendy. The real killer had never even appeared in the investigation. The case dropped back to absolute zero. But now there was another problem. The DNA sample from Wendy's clothing was too small and too degraded to upload into CODIS, the national database that could match unknown DNA against profiles of convicted offenders. They had the killer's genetic signature. They just could not match it to a name. In 2000, Klan tested the sample again with updated methods. Not enough. In 2009, the most advanced techniques available at the time were applied. The results were better, strong enough to definitively clear the original suspects, but still not strong enough to generate a database match. 3 tests across 11 years. 3 dead ends. Klan remembered a night standing outside Tom Bergen's bar, just down the street from where Wendy's body had been found. Detective Frank Boland stood beside him in the dark, cigarette in hand, looking out at the street. "This case will be solved long after I'm gone," Boland said. Not bitterly, just honestly. The kind of honesty that comes from years of pushing against a wall that will not move. Boland eventually retired, and then he was gone. He never saw what came next. Because in the summer of 2016, Harry Klan Jr. sat down with the DNA sample one final time. The technology had advanced in ways that simply did not exist in 1998. He ran the test. This time, the result was different. He picked up his phone, he typed 4 words to Detective Bengtson, and pressed send. "Are you sitting down?" Frank Boland had been wrong. The case was not going to wait until after he was gone. It was being solved right now. Detective Richard Bengtson had been working Wendy's case for years. He was one of the original 8 detectives assigned to the LAPD cold case unit when it was created in 2001, and by 2016, he was the only one of those original 8 still working there. Wendy's murder book, thick binders of reports, evidence logs, and interview transcripts sat neatly on his desk. He had read through it so many times he could recite parts from memory. When Klan's text came in, Bengtson called him back immediately. The DNA had finally produced enough genetic markers to run a search against the state database, and it had come back with a match. Bengtson asked for the name, Edwin Dean Richardson. The name meant nothing to him at first. No connection to Wendy, no connection to her family, her friends, her neighborhood. Edwin Dean Richardson had never appeared in the investigation. Not in 1968, not in 1998, not in 2009. He was nobody Wendy Hallison had ever known. He was something far more dangerous than that. As Bankson began pulling Richardson's background, the picture that emerged was deeply disturbing. Richardson was not a jealous boyfriend or a man with a personal grievance. He was a drifter, a man who had spent his entire adult life moving from state to state, working odd jobs, staying nowhere long enough to be remembered or tracked. His criminal history went back to his childhood, escalating from small offenses to serious ones. In 1960, he was convicted of attempted robbery and kidnapping in San Diego and sentenced to 8 years in prison. He served the full term. In April 1968, he was released on parole. 5 months later, Wendy Hallison was murdered. 5 months. That is the distance between the prison gate and Wendy's trunk. Then came the detail that made Bankson's blood run cold. Richardson's mother lived in mid-city Los Angeles. He was not a random stranger passing through. He was local. He knew that neighborhood. He knew Fairfax Avenue. He had reason to be in that part of the city in the weeks after his parole, because his mother was there. Think about what that means. While Wendy's family spent decades wondering who could have known she would be on that street at that time, the answer was no one. Nobody had to know. Richardson was not there because he had been watching Wendy specifically. He was there because his mother lived nearby, and he was a freshly paroled man with nowhere to be. Wendy was not targeted. She was simply there. And now that 1968 eyewitness report clicked into place. A white man seen at the thrifty while Wendy was shopping. The same man spotted again at the gas station while she filled up her tank. Both locations, both times. He had followed her step by step without her ever knowing. That was Richardson. He had walked into that store, seen a young woman alone, and made a decision, not from personal history or emotion, from cold, calculating, predatory instinct. He selected her. He watched her move. He followed her to the gas station, and when the moment came, he acted. Wendy Hallison never had a chance to know what was happening until it was already too late, and she was not the only one. As investigators dug into Richardson's history, they found a pattern repeated across multiple states and multiple years. In November 1977, a 21-year-old woman named Joanna Boner disappeared from Belmont County, Ohio, after leaving a family gathering. Her body was found on New Year's Eve, dumped in a ravine across the West Virginia border. Young woman, alone, followed, car abandoned, identical to what happened to Wendy 9 years earlier. Richardson had fled Belmont County before anyone could catch him. An investigator named Tom McCourt spent 3 years chasing him across the country before a discarded phone bill found in a trash can traced him to a trailer park in Mesa, Arizona. He was arrested there and extradited back to Ohio. On the flight back, Richardson did something that revealed exactly what kind of man he was. He started talking, calmly. Almost with pride, he began to detail his past actions, calmly describing another unsolved case where he had concealed the victim's remains and left them in a remote location. He described it the way a person describes something they are quietly proud of, not a confession driven by guilt, a boast. What Richardson did not know was that investigators already knew exactly who that woman was. They knew her name, they knew where her body had been found. Every word he spoke on that flight was not a secret being shared, it was a case being closed. The woman Richardson had boasted about on that flight had a name, Marla Jean Hires, 23 years old, a wife, a mother of a 2-year-old child. On the morning of October 29, 1972, she left her home in Stanton, California before sunrise to get extra work done at her job as a claims adjuster in Rosemead. An ordinary Tuesday morning for a woman with a family to take care of. She never arrived at work. Her body was found the next day at the Yorba Linda Country Club, wrapped in old carpet and drapery, thrown down an embankment. Her car had been abandoned at a bank drive-thru with the keys still in the ignition. Exactly as Richardson had described it on that plane, with that calm, satisfied expression. In 2004, DNA from Marla's case was matched to Richardson, already sitting in an Ohio prison for Joanna Boner's murder. Justice moved for Marla. By 2006, a 70-year-old Richardson stood before a California court on an oxygen tank, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and was sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars in 2013 at age 77, 4 years before his DNA was finally matched to Wendy Jo Hallison. When Bankson confirmed the DNA match to Wendy's case in 2016 and realized Richardson had been dead for 4 years, his reaction was immediate and unfiltered. He cursed. "Even alive and in prison is better than dead," he said, "because then I get to go to him and say, guess what? I'm going to put another charge on you." That moment had been stolen by time. Richardson had died without knowing that his DNA had been found on Wendy's clothing, without knowing that the case he thought he had buried in 1968 had been reopened 3 times, tested 4 times, and finally solved. He died believing he had gotten away with it. He had not. There is something deeply unsatisfying about a killer dying before the full accounting arrives. No final courtroom scene. No moment where he has to hear Wendy's name said out loud by a judge. No chance to look him in the eye and tell him his name is now permanently attached to what he did. For Bengtson, for the family, for everyone who had worked this case, that absence stung, but the identification still mattered. Because Richardson being dead did not mean the truth could not be found. It just changed how they found it. Because Richardson was dead, investigators could not take a new sample from him directly. Instead, they went back to the Orange County case. The Marla Hires investigation and used the blood sample already confirmed as Richardson's during that prosecution. They ran it directly against the DNA recovered from Wendy's clothing. It matched. Confirmed. Absolute. After 48 years, 4 DNA tests, and a killer who had already died in prison, it was him. But Wendy and Marla were just the ones science could prove. In 1969, 1 year after Wendy disappeared, a young woman named Margie Shute vanished near that same thrifty store on Fairfax Avenue. Her body was found in Burbank, beaten and strangled. Her car was recovered in the thrifty parking lot, the exact same lot where Wendy had shopped the day she was killed. Same location, same method. Richardson was still in the area. Detectives believed he almost certainly killed Margie Shute as well, but the physical evidence from her 1969 case had been lost over the decades. No DNA left to test. Her case remains officially unsolved. Bengtson had spent months studying Richardson's pattern, the victims, the locations, the gaps in his record where nothing was documented but something almost certainly happened. He said it plainly. This guy didn't stop at 1 or 2 or 3. There's no chance in hell. Richardson had spent decades moving through American cities. He drifted. He worked odd jobs. He never put down roots in any single place long enough to be remembered or tracked. He killed, and then he moved on, and then he disappeared into the next town, the next state, the next ordinary street where nobody knew him. That pattern, combined with the confirmed victims, the suspected victims, and the years he spent moving freely, painted a picture of a man whose actual body count was almost certainly far higher than what was ever officially connected to his name. How many cold case files across the country carry a woman's name that should also carry his? How many families are sitting with the same unanswered question that Wendy's family carried for 48 years? That question may never have a complete answer, and that might be the darkest part of this entire story. In the summer of 2017, Bengtson picked up the phone and called Linda. Linda Trocino, Wendy's older sister, the woman who had said no to a Sunday shopping trip 48 years earlier and had never entirely put that moment down, was out at brunch with her husband when her phone rang. She did not recognize the number. She assumed it was a telemarketer and let it go to voicemail. Think about that for a moment. 48 years of waiting, of her father's promise, of carrying the question of who killed her sister, and the answer arrived as a voicemail she almost did not listen to. Later, sitting alone in her car, she pressed play. An LAPD detective, asking her to come in. He had something he needed to tell her about her sister's case. Her hands started shaking before the message even finished. She drove to LAPD headquarters and walked inside wearing Wendy's necklace around her neck. She sat down across from Detective Bengtson and retired Deputy District Attorney Peter Berman, the two men who had worked Wendy's case for years, who had kept those thick binders on their desks when everyone else had moved on, who had refused to accept that the answer would never come. When Bengtson walked her through Richardson's criminal history, who he was, what he had done, how many other women had crossed his path, Linda shook her head slowly. "Unbelievable," she said. On the table between them sat 2 old cardboard boxes. Inside were Wendy's belongings, recovered from her car in 1968 and kept in evidence ever since. School papers, personal letters, her driver's license, objects that had been sitting in a storage room for 48 years. One box still carried the original evidence tag that detectives had filled out in 1968. The paper wrapping inside had aged so long it was beginning to fall apart, disintegrating quietly after nearly half a century of waiting. 48 years of evidence from a life interrupted on a Sunday afternoon, sitting in 2 cardboard boxes, waiting for their owner to be found. Bengtson looked at Linda and said the words her father had died waiting to hear. "We found who killed your sister." Linda sat quietly. No sudden outburst, no dramatic reaction, just the slow, heavy feeling of 48 years of not knowing, coming off her shoulders at last, gently, like something that had been pressing down for so long she had forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. "I wish there was some way I could thank you," she said. "It just means so much." When the meeting ended, Bengtson and Berman carried those 2 boxes out to the car. Linda's husband Tony stood there watching, then turned to the detective. "The LAPD did its job," he said. "The case is closed." But it will never really be closed, because we will never forget Wendy. A woman went to buy a hairdryer on a warm Sunday afternoon in 1968. She drove down Fairfax Avenue, bought what she came for, and started heading home. She never made it, but her father made a promise before he died. Her sister kept it for decades. A criminalist ran the same test 4 times because 4 times is what it took. A detective refused to close a murder book that everyone else had shelved. And 48 years later, in a room with 2 disintegrating cardboard boxes and a necklace that once belonged to a 22-year-old art student, the truth finally came home. Wendy Jo Hallison is not a cold case file anymore. She is a woman who loved her poodle, played piano, and smiled in photographs that still light up a room. She is a sister who called on a Sunday morning because she did not want to shop alone. She is a daughter whose father kept walking into a police station year after year because showing up was the only way he knew to fight for her. She is a 22-year-old art student whose life was stolen on an ordinary afternoon by a man who had just been released from prison 5 months earlier, who had chosen her at random from a store on Fairfax Avenue, and who had died years before. Justice could reach him by name. But her family did not forget. The detectives did not give up. The science finally caught up, and the world knows what happened. The world knows her name. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment and tell us why. Do you think Richardson had more victims out there that science will never be able to officially connect to him? After watching how long this family had to fight for the truth, do you think cold cases should ever officially be closed, or should every unsolved case stay open no matter how many years pass? And if you were Linda, sitting in that room after 48 years of waiting, what would you have said to those 2 detectives? A woman opened her front door and saw a clown standing on her porch. She smiled. Those were her last happy seconds alive. This is not a movie. This is not something someone made up. This happened on a Saturday morning in May 1990 in one of the wealthiest, safest neighborhoods in the entire United States, in broad daylight, in front of her son. And the person who planned it had been counting on one thing, that she would smile. They were right. Wellington, Florida was a fortress for the rich. Not rich like a nice house and a good car. Rich like your backyard has a private runway and a hangar where you park your plane. Rich like Bruce Springsteen has a house nearby. Bill Gates was building a property in the area. The Kennedy family played golf minutes away. Mar-a-Lago, 126 rooms, 20 acres of pure power, was in the same orbit. The Aero Club was the crown jewel inside Wellington. Every single home in this neighborhood was built around a private 4,000-foot grass airstrip. Residents flew their personal planes to work 2 or 3 times a week, the way most people drive to the grocery store. Some flew 50 miles each way. They had hangars instead of garages. This was a community where crime was something that happened somewhere else, in Miami, in Fort Lauderdale, in the places these people had specifically paid to escape from. Wellington had one of the lowest crime rates in the state of Florida. It was consistently listed among the safest cities in the entire country, which is exactly why what happened on May 26, 1990 didn't just break one family. It broke the illusion that money could protect you from everything. Marlene Warren had earned her place in this world. She was not born into wealth. She grew up in Mount Clemens, Michigan, a small, quiet life on her grandfather's farm with her sisters. She was the kind of person who made things with her hands, who found joy in ordinary moments. She baked, she painted, she laughed easily, but life hit her early and it hit her hard. She was a mother of 2 by the time she was 18. When her first marriage ended, she was 20 years old, alone, with 2 young boys and no safety net. She carried that weight without falling apart. She met Michael Warren, built a second life with him, moved to Florida, and turned nothing into something real. Rental properties in West Palm Beach, a used car business, an airplane, a racehorse, a dream home in the Aero Club. And then, in 1988, her oldest son John was killed in a car accident. He was 22 years old. That loss changed something in the Warren household permanently. The marriage began to crack from the inside. The arguments started. The distance grew. By 1990, Marlene knew her marriage was falling apart, but she kept going, the way she always had. She co-managed the properties. She ran the business. She showed up every single day. That Saturday morning, she was making breakfast for her son Joey and his friends. There was one more thing about Marlene that everyone who knew her remembered immediately, something that, in hindsight, makes this story even more disturbing. Marlene loved clowns, not as a passing interest, as a deep, genuine, lifelong joy. As a teenager, she had sat down and painted a portrait of a smiling clown with her own hands, a canvas her mother surely kept on her wall for the rest of her life. Her family had an entire room in their home dedicated to clown art and figurines. Marlene saw clowns as pure happiness, as color and celebration and innocence. She could never have imagined that someone out there was studying her, that someone had looked at her love of clowns and thought, that is the door, that is how we get her to open it, that is how we make her smile right before she dies. Her own joy was used as the weapon against her. May 26, 1990, Memorial Day weekend. Michael Warren had left early that morning. He was heading to the horse track with friends, a regular routine for him. Marlene was home with Joey. Joey was 21, recovering from a broken leg, his left leg in a cast. He had a few friends over. They were at the kitchen table having breakfast. It was a holiday. Warm weather, no plans, just a normal, slow Saturday morning. Around 10:45, something caught their attention through the glass panel of the front door. Color, bright, unusual color coming up the driveway. Someone at the table actually said it first. Someone had sent a gift, maybe for Joey's broken leg, maybe just a holiday surprise. Whatever it was, it looked cheerful and harmless through the glass. Marlene walked to the door. She opened it. Standing on her porch was a figure in full clown costume. Orange wig exploding out from both sides. White face paint covering every inch of skin, you could only see the eyes. Red bald nose. A wide painted smile in red over the white. Polka dot jumpsuit. White gloves. Black shoes, the only thing not screaming color. In one hand, a bouquet of fresh carnations. In the other, two balloons. One with a snow-white image printed on it. The other balloon, silver, floating gently, had 3 words written across it in large letters. You're the greatest. Marlene looked at this explosion of color and joy standing on her doorstep on a Saturday morning. A clown with flowers, a balloon telling her she was the greatest, in the neighborhood where nothing bad ever happened, on a holiday weekend. To Marlene, clowns weren't a symbol of fear. They were everything good. She saw them as pure innocence. The same innocence she had painted as a teenager, the same warmth that filled her family's circus room. She smiled. She said, "Oh, how pretty." She stepped forward and reached out to take the flowers. She was looking at the painted red smile on the white face. She was thinking about who had sent this. She was happy in that exact moment. Genuinely, completely happy. She didn't see the white-gloved hand rising. She didn't see the cold steel crack. In the kitchen, Joey froze. He thought a balloon had popped. That half-second of confusion. The brain trying to make the sound normal, trying to find an explanation that isn't terrifying. Then he heard something else. The heavy, unmistakable sound of a body hitting the floor. He ran to the door. His friends ran behind him. And there was Marlene, on the ground in the doorway, critically wounded and fighting for her life. The carnations scattered across the porch around her, the balloons still floating above her, cheerful and horrible at the same time. Joey looked up. The clown was walking away, not running, walking, homely, unhurried, like someone who had just finished a job and was heading back to the car. The white gloves, the black shoes moving at a steady, unbothered pace down the driveway toward a waiting white Chrysler LeBaron convertible, no license plate on the back. Joey grabbed his mother's car and tried to chase it. His leg was in a cast. He couldn't catch up. Nearby, neighbor Bill Kramer was out walking his dog. He heard what sounded like a nail gun, that sharp, mechanical crack. He saw the commotion at the house, saw young people running out screaming that Joey's mother had been shot. His wife called 911. But in those few seconds before he got in that car, in the chaos and the horror and the disbelief, Joey did one thing that would matter 27 years later. He looked directly at the clown's face. Through all the paint and the wig and the full disguise, as the figure turned toward the car, Joey looked at the only part of this person that the costume couldn't hide. The eyes. Brown. Deep, dark brown eyes looking back at him without panic, without rush, without a single trace of guilt or hesitation. Then the white LeBaron shifted into gear and coasted away. No speed, no urgency, just gone. Like leaving Marlene Warren on her own front porch was nothing. 2 days later, on May 28, 1990, at 9:30 in the evening, Marlene was taken off life support. She was 40 years old. Joey had been there the whole time, holding her hand, telling her he loved her, telling her they were going to get justice. He watched the machine get turned off. Then he walked out of that hospital alone. Authorities had one word for what happened: Not a robbery, not random, not a mistake, an assassination, planned, precise, executed by someone who knew exactly where Marlene would be, exactly when Michael would be gone, and exactly what it would take to make her open that door with a smile on her face. The killer had known her, studied her, used her own joy against her, which meant the investigation didn't need to start with strangers. It needed to start with the man who left for the racetrack that morning. The husband. Joey sat next to his mother's hospital bed for 2 days straight. He held her hand. He talked to her even when she couldn't respond. He told her he loved her. He begged her not to leave. And when the doctors finally said there was no hope, when they said the physical trauma was too permanent, too severe, Joey leaned close one last time. He made her a promise. We are going to get justice. Then they turned off the machine. Joey walked out of that hospital carrying a promise he had no idea how to keep. He was 21 years old. His mother was gone. And somewhere out there, a clown had driven away in a white car and simply disappeared. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office moved immediately. Crime scene tape around the porch, evidence bags, photographs, interviews with Joey and his friends. They collected the balloons, the scattered carnations, the props that had been used to make Marlene step forward and smile. They canvassed the neighborhood. They talked to Bill Kramer, the neighbor who heard the shot. And then they did what detectives always do first. They went to find the husband. Michael Warren was not what you would expect from someone living in the Aero Club. Wellington was a world of old money, private planes, and country club dinners. Michael did not belong in that picture. Neighbors remembered him as rough around the edges. One person described him bluntly, a used car rental wreck kind of personality. He never showed up at the country club, never became part of the community fabric the way Marlene had. He was a man living inside a life that Marlene had largely built, and he knew it. He started out as a meat inspector. From there, he opened Bargain Motors on North Dixie Highway in West Palm Beach. Not a showroom, not a luxury dealership. Bargain Motors was the place you went when your credit was destroyed and nobody else would touch you. That was the business model, and Michael ran it with an edge. In 1983, 7 years before Marlene's murder, he had already been arrested for odometer tampering, rolling back mileage on vehicles to make them appear newer than they were. He pleaded guilty, got probation, kept the business running. Strange things had a way of happening around Michael Warren. His plane disappeared once and turned up with a broken engine. Nobody could explain it. A racehorse died under unclear circumstances. Small things, easy to dismiss individually. But together they sketched a portrait of a man around whom convenient accidents tended to occur. Detectives wanted to look at him hard, but Michael Warren had one thing that shut that door immediately. He was at the racetrack. Multiple witnesses. Left early that morning, confirmed on both ends. His alibi was not just solid, it was airtight. Michael Warren did not pull that trigger. That much was established fast. But then detectives found out what Marlene had been saying before she died. Not once. Not in a passing moment of frustration. Marlene had told the two people closest to her, her mother Shirley and her son Joey, the exact same words. She had looked them in the eyes and said, "If anything happens to me, Michael did it." She said it to Shirley with fear in her voice, real fear, the kind a mother recognizes immediately. And when Shirley got the call that her daughter had been shot, her mind went to one place without hesitation. She said it to Joey too. Joey had pushed back. "No way, impossible. This man raised me since I was 3 years old." And Marlene had looked at her son and said, calm and serious, "Don't put it past him." She had been scared enough to warn the people she loved, scared enough to name him by name. She had seen something in her marriage that told her this was where it was heading. And she was right. With Michael's alibi holding, investigators needed to find whoever he might have used. They drove away from the pristine lawns of the Aero Club and headed toward North Dixie Highway. They walked into Bargain Motors, and the moment they started asking questions, every single employee pointed in the same direction. To understand who they were being pointed toward, you need to understand the world of Bargain Motors first. This was not an office full of suits and name tags. This was a gritty, cash-heavy operation where cars were repossessed from people who sometimes came back angry. It was not a safe or gentle business, and running the repossessions, tracking down vehicles in rough neighborhoods, confronting hostile owners, taking back cars from people who desperately needed them, was a 27-year-old woman named Sheila Keene. Sheila was not a background character. It was the kind of person you noticed the moment she walked into a room. She was fierce, magnetic, and completely comfortable in dangerous situations. She carried a gun, told coworkers plainly that people were crazy and you had to be ready. She had recently walked out of a volatile marriage to Richard Keene, a man with a highly dangerous history and a track record of severe federal offenses. A marriage so dangerous, she had filed a domestic violence injunction against him in January 1990 after he grabbed and threatened her. The court granted it immediately. Sheila had spent years surviving environments that would break most people. She didn't flinch. She didn't panic. She moved through chaos like she had been trained for it. And she was completely, devotedly in love with Michael Warren. Coworker Della Ward said it simply. You could just see it the moment Sheila looked at him. She loved him. You could see it in her eyes. The affair was not a secret. Not at Bargain Motors, not at Sheila's apartment complex. Employees watched them leave together for long lunches and return hours later. They traveled together, claiming business trips. They were openly affectionate in the workplace in a way that left nothing to the imagination. One employee put it plainly, there was no hiding it. The doors were left wide open. At Sheila's apartment, the one Michael was paying rent on after she left Richard, the neighbors had no idea she had ever been married to anyone else. They saw Michael there constantly. They saw him come and go like a man coming home. They assumed, without question, that Michael Warren and Sheila Keene were husband and wife. Meanwhile, both Michael and Sheila told investigators the same story. Just friends. A working relationship. Nothing more. Not a single person who had watched them together believed one word of it. Now here is where the motive stops being circumstantial and starts being terrifying. Marlene Warren was not just Michael's wife. She was the financial architecture of everything they had. The rental properties in West Palm Beach, worth approximately $1 million, were in Marlene's name. The assets, the real estate, the business interests. Marlene had built all of it, and the law protected her ownership of it completely. A divorce would have been catastrophic for Michael. Marlene would have walked away with the majority. He would have lost the Aero Club home, lost the properties, lost the lifestyle, been left with a car lot on North Dixie Highway and nothing else. But if Marlene died, Michael inherited everything, 100%. The properties, the businesses, the life insurance payout, the home. Investigators estimated the total at well over $1 million flowing directly to Michael the moment Marlene was gone. Divorce meant losing it all. Death meant winning it all. But what made investigators' blood run cold was not just the math. When detectives began interviewing the mechanics and salesmen at Bargain Motors, a pattern emerged that went far beyond suspicion. Michael Warren hadn't just been complaining about his wife at home. According to multiple employees, he had walked into that car lot after fighting with Marlene, looked his workers directly in the eye, and made an offer. $10,000 in cash to anyone willing to permanently eliminate his wife. He said whoever did it would never have to work another day in their life. At the time, the employees thought it was a man blowing off steam, a dark joke, the kind of thing frustrated people say and don't mean. But on May 26, 1990, standing outside Bargain Motors talking to detectives, those same employees realized something that made the air leave the room. Michael hadn't been joking at all. The picture investigators were now looking at was complete and damning. Michael Warren had $1 million motive. He had a fierce, gun-carrying girlfriend who ran his repossessions, who had nowhere else to go, and who was completely devoted to him. He had multiple witnesses who heard him openly ask for his wife to be killed. And he had the perfect shield, a racetrack full of friends miles away, while Marlene answered her door. He didn't pull the trigger, which meant the entire case now came down to one question. One person, one name that every single employee at Bargain Motors had already given them. Did the repo woman, the one with the brown eyes and the gun and the devotion to Michael Warren, did she put on an orange wig, paint a smile over her face, and walk up to that door with flowers in her hand? Detectives were about to follow the trail of the carnations and the balloons straight to her doorstep, and what they found there was going to shock even them. Detectives had a name. Now they needed a trail. In every murder investigation, there is a moment where the case either builds into something real or dissolves into nothing. For the Marlene Warren case, that moment came when investigators stopped looking at the big picture and started following the small details. The flowers, the balloons, the costume, the car. Each one led somewhere, and every single place they led pointed straight back to Sheila Keene. Start with the balloons. 2 balloons left behind at the scene, one with a Snow White image, one silver balloon with 3 words printed across it, "You're the greatest." Detectives needed to know where those specific balloons came from. They canvassed local stores and narrowed it down fast. A public supermarket on North Military Trail in West Palm Beach. One detail stopped investigators cold the moment they heard it. That Publix was exactly 1 mile from Sheila Keene's apartment. It was Memorial Day weekend. That Saturday morning, people were flooding into that same store, buying things for barbecues, picking up drinks for the holiday. Normal families, normal errands. A warm Florida morning full of people with nowhere urgent to be. 2 employees remembered a woman who did not fit that picture at all. She came in and moved with purpose, straight to the floral section, straight to the balloons, those specific balloons. She wasn't browsing. She wasn't relaxed like everyone around her. Her hair was long and brown, pulled back in a ponytail. Both employees used the same word to describe the way she carried herself. Male mannerisms. A directness, a tension in her movements that did not match the slow, lazy holiday mood filling the rest of that store. She paid and left. That was less than 2 hours before Marlene Warren opened her front door. Both employees picked Sheila Keene out of a photo lineup. Now go back one more day, Friday night, the night before the murder. A costume shop called Spotlight Capezio on South Dixie Highway in West Palm Beach was closing up for the evening. Workers were done for the day, locking up, ready to go home. Then someone knocked on the door. A woman, tall, thin, long chocolate brown hair, big brown eyes. She said she needed a costume. Tonight, right now. The workers told her to come back tomorrow. The shop was closed. She didn't move. She said she couldn't wait. She needed something right now. They let her in. She went straight to the clown section. No browsing, no hesitation. She knew what she wanted. She picked out a full clown suit, an orange afro wig, clown makeup, and a red sponge nose. Then she made one specific request that the workers would remember clearly when detectives came asking. She needed enough white face paint to cover her entire face, not highlights. Not partial coverage, complete coverage, every visible inch of skin hidden under white. She paid in cash, no name, no paper trail. She bought everything needed to stand on a doorstep in broad daylight and be completely unrecognizable. Everything except the shoes. She already had those. She walked out into the Friday night with a bag full of a costume and a plan that was now less than 24 hours from execution. Both employees later sat down with a photo lineup. Both identified Sheila Keene. Now the car, a white Chrysler LeBaron convertible, no license plate, the getaway vehicle that witnesses saw the clown drive away in calmly after the shooting. Detectives needed to know where it came from. What they found was not a random theft. What they found was a plan that had been set in motion 45 days before Marlene died. A rental company called Payless Rent a Car operated near Bargain Motors on North Dixie Highway. A couple named the Restivos had rented a white LeBaron from Payless. When they finished with the car ahead of schedule, they grabbed the yellow pages to find the number and call for drop-off instructions. This is where it gets chilling. Michael Warren had taken out an advertisement for Bargain Motors in that same phone book. The ad featured the words PALESS in large print, nearly identical in appearance to the Payless Rent a Car listing. The rest of those dialed the wrong number. They reached Bargain Motors. Someone at Bargain Motors picked up without missing a beat and gave them clean, confident instructions. Leave the car outside the gate at Payless with the keys in the sun visor. The Restivos did exactly that. They left a white Chrysler LeBaron sitting outside, unlocked, keys visible, and walked away. The car was stolen shortly after. 7 weeks later, that same car was parked in Marlene Warren's driveway. But the phone call alone could still have been coincidence. Someone picked up, gave standard instructions, and the car ended up in the wrong hands. That explanation existed until detectives talked to Claude Poitras. Poitras was an employee at Bargain Motors. He had been there the day the Restivos called, and what he told investigators removed every trace of coincidence from this story permanently. He said that shortly after that phone call came in, he drove Michael Warren and Sheila Keene, together, both of them, directly to the Payless lot. He watched them get into the white Chrysler LeBaron with his own eyes. He watched them drive away in it together 45 days before Marlene Warren was murdered, and before Michael got out of Poitras' car that day, he turned and said 4 words that Poitras never forgot. Don't say anything to anyone. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a spontaneous act by a jealous woman who snapped one morning. The getaway car had been secured 45 days in advance. Both Michael and Sheila had physically stolen it together. The murder weapon's escape route had been planned nearly 7 weeks before the trigger was pulled. The trap had been built long before Marlene ever walked to her front door. Detectives moved on Sheila's apartment with a search warrant. What they found pulled the net tighter. On the soles of her black lace-up shoes, plain, practical, the exact style witnesses had described on the clown that morning, forensic investigators found fibers, orange-yellow acrylic fibers, the kind used in clown wigs. They took everything to the lab. Under high-powered microscopes, scientists compared those fibers to samples from the orange wig purchased at Spotlight Costumers, to fibers recovered from inside the abandoned LeBaron, and to fibers collected from the balloon ribbon left at the crime scene. The composition matched across all 4 locations. Same material, same structure, same source. The wig's fibers had traveled from the costume shop to the stolen car to the crime scene and onto the bottom of Sheila Keene's shoes. Inside the LeBaron, detectives also found a single strand of brown human hair. In 1990, forensic science was limited. They could not yet extract a full DNA profile from a hair strand the way modern labs can today. But when scientists placed that hair under a high-powered microscope alongside a sample collected from Sheila Keene, what they saw was not ambiguous. The thickness matched. The medulla pattern matched. The color pigment matched. Every measurable physical characteristic of that hair was identical to Sheila Keene's sample. She had been inside that stolen vehicle. Science could see it clearly. But in 1990, a microscopic hair match was circumstantial. It pointed at her. It did not chain her to the wall. When detectives brought Sheila in and laid all of this in front of her, she had one answer for everything. She was out repossessing cars that morning, working in the field. Detectives pushed back. They asked for work logs, bank authorization paperwork, addresses of vehicles she had gone to collect, the name of a single person who had seen her with a tow truck that morning. She could not provide one. Not one address, not one car, not one witness. Repo work runs on paperwork, bank orders, legal authorization, location records. Without those, her alibi wasn't just shaky. It was completely hollow. She had a mountain of physical evidence placing her at a murder scene, and absolutely nothing placing her anywhere else. So here is exactly where the investigation stood. 2 store employees had independently identified Sheila's face from photo lineups, once at the costume shop, once at the Publix 1 mile from her apartment. Matching wig fibers were found on the soles of her own shoes. A Bargain Motors employee had watched her and Michael steal the getaway car together 45 days before the murder. Her alibi had collapsed the moment detectives asked one follow-up question, and the victim herself had named Michael Warren before she died. The evidence was not hiding. It was screaming. 2 eyewitnesses pointing at her photo. A stolen car tied to both her and Michael 45 days prior. Matching fibers on her closet floor. A microscopic hair match inside the vehicle. An alibi with nothing behind it. So why didn't they arrest her? What exactly were they waiting for? The answer lived inside the prosecutor's office, a fatal hesitation, a decision to wait for just a little more that would allow this case to slip through their fingers completely. The investigation would freeze, the trail would go cold, and while justice slept, Michael and Sheila were already planning their next move. The evidence was there. Everyone in that prosecutor's office knew it. The photo lineups, the fibers, the stolen car. Claude Poitras watching Michael and Sheila drive away in that LeBaron together 45 days before the murder. The microscopic hair match. The hollow alibi with nothing behind it. They knew, but knowing and proving are 2 completely different things in a courtroom. And the prosecutors kept doing the one thing that would ultimately cost them everything. They waited. The internal argument went in circles. Do we have enough? Maybe. But what if a defense attorney tears apart the photo lineup? What if a jury looks at microscopic hair comparison and calls it junk science? What if we go to trial and lose, and she walks free forever because double jeopardy means we never get another shot? So they decided to wait for one more piece, just one more solid thing. That one more piece never came. And while prosecutors debated in conference rooms, the trail outside was going cold by the day. Witnesses moved, memories shifted. The sharp urgency that lives in the first weeks of a murder investigation slowly bled out. Cases don't stay fresh forever. They age, they soften. This one was aging fast. Meanwhile, Michael Warren was not sitting quietly. In 1991, about a year after Marlene's murder, Michael went on the radio. He sat down for an interview, brought Joey with him, and performed the role of grieving widower and wrongly accused man with remarkable confidence. He denied everything, said the police were trying to destroy his business, suggested Marlene had probably been killed by an angry tenant or a disgruntled car buyer. someone from the rough side of their business dealings. The interviewer asked him directly, when had he last spoken to Sheila Keene? Michael barely paused. About a month ago, he said. We don't really talk anymore. At the exact moment he said those words, Sheila was present in his life constantly. The same woman he had just publicly placed a month in his past was close, connected, and very much still there. He looked into that microphone and lied without flinching. It was an unnecessary lie. The kind a guilty man tells, not because he has to, but because lying has become his default setting. In 1992, investigators shifted their approach. If they couldn't build a murder case strong enough for trial, they were going to dismantle Michael Warren's world from a different angle. When detectives had gone through Bargain Motors' records during the murder investigation, they had found something else running underneath the car business. Michael had been systematically rolling back odometers on vehicles. Cars with 90,000 miles sold as 40,000-mile cars. People with destroyed credit. People who came to Bargain Motors because nobody else would help them were paying for vehicles they believed were in decent condition. The cars were not. Michael had also been repossessing vehicles and reporting them stolen to collect insurance money, running both ends of the same fraud simultaneously. In October 1992, authorities raided Bargain Motors. When they finished going through the records, Michael Warren was facing 43 counts: racketeering, odometer tampering, grand theft, insurance fraud. He was convicted, sentenced to 9 years. He served less than 4. Michael Warren walked out of a minimum security Florida prison on New Year's Eve 1997. He had entered as a murder suspect and a convicted fraudster. He walked out owing nothing more, at least legally. The murder case was still open, technically. But the files had gone into storage. Nobody was talking about Sheila Keene anymore. And for Marlene's son Joey, time had frozen completely on that Saturday morning in May 1990. He was only 21 when his mother's life was taken right in front of him. The trauma didn't just hurt him, it restructured him from the inside out. The grief came in waves he didn't know how to survive. He found himself spiraling into an incredibly dark place, trying to cope with a reality that no 21-year-old should ever face. The anniversary of May 26th became an unbearable emotional weight. Drive to his mother's grave and sit there in the dark trying to find answers that weren't there. He talked to her at that grave. Asked her questions, got nothing back. He said it himself, simply and honestly, I was just lost. His relationship with Michael had collapsed entirely after the murder. The man who had raised him since he was 3 years old, the only father he had ever known, was now the man his mother had named with her dying fear. Joey could not hold both versions of that person in his mind at the same time. The estrangement was complete. The family that had existed before May 26, 1990 was gone, and nothing had grown back in its place. He was grieving his mother, grieving his family, and watching the case that was supposed to bring justice go completely silent. For years he suffered in that silence. Then, in 1996, something came forward from a direction nobody had expected. A man named John Moran Sr. had spent years working in the orbit of Michael Warren's world, dumping stolen cars, turning back odometers, doing the dirty mechanical work that kept Bargain Motors running. He was an auto mechanic who knew where bodies were buried. As Moran Sr. lay dying, he made sure certain secrets didn't go with him. He called his son, John Moran Jr., close, and he told him things. He said that on the morning of May 26, 1990, there had not been one getaway car. There had been 2. The white LeBaron was the visible one, the one witnesses saw, the one detectives traced. But Moran Sr. said he had personally been driving a second car that morning, a backup vehicle, an escape route that investigators never knew existed. He told his son he knew who had planned the entire murder. He knew where the gun was. He knew where the clown costume had been disposed of. And he gave his son a specific location, a canal in Palm Beach County, where a car had been submerged with the evidence sealed inside. John Moran Jr. brought this to detectives. Investigators took it seriously enough to act. They got divers into that canal at the exact location Moran Jr. provided. They searched the bottom. They found a car. A 1982 Audi 4000s sitting exactly where Moran Jr. said it would be. Inside, tube socks, pieces of blue and red cloth, a shoe sole, no gun, no costume, nothing that could close the case. Either the evidence had degraded beyond recovery after years underwater, or someone had been there before the divers. Either way, the canal gave them a sunken car and nothing that mattered. The murder weapon and the clown costume were never found. Not then. Not ever. The investigation hit the floor again. Michael Warren left Florida and built a completely new life. He settled in Abingdon, Virginia, a quiet mountain town far from Palm Beach County and everything it knew about him. He opened a fast food restaurant called the Purple Cow just across the border in Kingsport, Tennessee. He was known locally as a relaxed, friendly guy who ran a good drive-thru and kept his past to himself. His neighbors loved him. By his side was his new wife, a pleasant, soft-spoken blonde woman who went by the name Debbie. He said her father had called her that since she was a little girl, just a childhood nickname. She had dyed her hair, changed her look, and spoken carefully to everyone she met, the people of Abingdon and Kingsport. They were just a sweet, hard-working older couple building something simple together. Nobody in that town had ever heard of Wellington, Florida. Nobody knew about a clown. But in 2002, a detective in Palm Beach County pulled up a freshly filed Las Vegas marriage certificate. And there, under the bright neon lights of a Vegas chapel, the true identity behind the woman called Debbie was finally on paper. Debbie was Sheila Keene, the woman every Bargain Motors employee had pointed to without hesitation, the woman whose face 2 store clerks had picked from photo lineups, the woman whose fibers were on her own shoes and whose hair was found inside a stolen murder vehicle, had married Marlene Warren's widower in a quiet Las Vegas ceremony. Let that land for a moment. The man whose wife had been executed on her own doorstep by a clown was now sharing a home, a bed, a business, and a life with the exact woman investigators had believed pulled the trigger since day one. Mission accomplished. 12 years after Marlene died, they were living in the mountains of Virginia running a drive-thru restaurant, and their neighbors thought they were wonderful. The law was completely powerless. It seemed like the perfect crime had actually worked. Michael and Sheila believed they had outrun the ghosts of Wellington entirely. They thought they were safe. They thought it was over. But what they didn't know, what neither of them could have known, was that science was changing, quietly, steadily, and somewhere in a dark evidence locker in Palm Beach County, a single strand of brown hair was waiting. It had all the time in the world. 24 years had passed. Marlene Warren's case was still technically open. It sat in a filing system inside the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. A thick folder full of photo lineups, fiber analysis reports, witness statements, and a microscopic hair comparison that had pointed directly at one person, but never been strong enough to close the door on her permanently. The world had moved on. Wellington had moved on. Most people who remembered the story filed it away under unsolved, one of those cases that gets talked about and then quietly forgotten. Joey had not forgotten, not for a single day. But in 2014, something changed. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office received a federal grant specifically designated for cold case investigations. With that funding, they built a dedicated cold case unit, a task force that brought together detectives from the Sheriff's Office, prosecutors from the State Attorney's Office, and direct involvement from the FBI. Their mandate was simple. Go back to the cases that technology couldn't close the first time. Retest everything with modern forensic tools. See what the science says now that it couldn't say before. The very first case they pulled from the shelf was the one everyone in that building already knew by heart, the killer clown. The hair strand recovered from the white LeBaron in 1990 had been sitting in that evidence locker for 24 years. In 1990, scientists could only place it under a microscope and say, the physical characteristics match Sheila Keene's sample. Same thickness, same pigment, same structure. It pointed at her. It did not chain her to anything. In 2014, the cold case unit sent that same strand to the FBI laboratory for a specialized analysis that didn't even exist when Marlene died, mitochondrial DNA testing. Unlike standard DNA analysis, which requires a fresh sample or an intact hair root, mitochondrial DNA lives inside the hair shaft itself, acting as a biological time capsule that doesn't degrade the way other organic material does. It can survive for decades, sealed in an evidence bag inside a storage locker. It carries a genetic signature passed down through the maternal line, unique, stable, and virtually indestructible. The FBI team extracted the sequence from that 24-year-old strand. The results came back with one conclusion. The mitochondrial DNA profile matched Sheila Keene Warren. Not similar, not probable, a match. The kind that stands up in federal court, the kind no defense attorney can wave away with talk of coincidence or contamination. After 24 years sitting in a dark evidence locker, that single strand of brown hair had just become the most powerful piece of evidence in the entire case. Sheila's own biology had waited patiently in that stolen car for 24 years, and now it was ready to testify. With the DNA match confirmed, investigators began building the updated picture of where Sheila and Michael were now. What they found genuinely stopped the detectives who had worked this case from the beginning. Michael Warren, the man whose wife had been tragically targeted by a clown, the man who had been the prime suspect from the very first anonymous phone call on the afternoon of the murder, had married Sheila Keene in Las Vegas in 2002. They had built a quiet life together in Abingdon, Virginia, a mountain town where nobody knew anything about Palm Beach County or a woman shot at her front door. They owned the Purple Cow restaurant in Kingsport, Tennessee, just across the state border, a small, popular drive-thru known locally for good food and an easygoing couple who ran it 6 days a week. Michael and Debbie Warren, as the locals knew them, were fixtures in that community, warm, generous, completely ordinary. When State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg learned that Michael Warren had married Sheila Keene 12 years after Marlene died, he used exactly 3 words: mission accomplished. But investigators didn't just find a marriage certificate. When they started quietly asking questions around the Purple Cow, what came back from former employees was something that made every detective in that task force go still. The rumor had been running through the restaurant staff for years. Debbie had killed Mike's ex-wife. She had dressed up as a clown to do it. Former employees told investigators they had heard it said more than once, not as wild speculation, but as accepted background information. Something dark and open that explained the couple's careful silence about their past. Something people whispered when Mike and Debbie weren't in the room. And then there was the Halloween detail that nobody who heard it could shake. Sheila, known to every employee as Debbie, had appeared at the Purple Cow one Halloween in full clown makeup. She had dressed as a clown voluntarily in front of her staff, smiling. A woman who investigators believed had worn that exact costume to execute Marlene Warren was putting the face paint back on at a Tennessee drive-thru like it was a fun holiday tradition. Like it meant nothing. Like she had completely gotten away with it and had nothing left to fear. On August 31, 2017, a grand jury in Palm Beach County returned an indictment, first-degree murder, with a firearm. 27 years after Marlene Warren had opened her front door and smiled at a bouquet of carnations, the legal machinery that had stalled and stuttered and gone silent for decades finally lurched back into motion. Detectives located Sheila and Michael in Virginia. They watched, they planned, they waited for the right moment. On September 26, 2017, Sheila Keene Warren was driving near her home in Abingdon when law enforcement pulled her over. She was placed under arrest. And in those first raw seconds, before attorneys, before strategy, before the legal machinery kicked in, Sheila Keene Warren asked one question. Not what is this about? Not I want a lawyer. Not I don't understand. She looked at the officers and said, "Are you going to arrest him too?" He pointed directly at Michael Warren. In 7 words, Sheila told investigators everything they had believed for 27 years. She knew exactly why she was being arrested. She considered Michael equally responsible for what happened on May 26, 1990, and her first instinct in the moment of her own capture was not to deny, not to deflect. It was to make sure he didn't escape the same net she had just fallen into. Prosecutors noted it immediately. It was the most honest thing Sheila Keene Warren had said since the morning the clown walked calmly away from Marlene's porch. Joey got a phone call. He had spent 27 years carrying the weight of a promise made at his mother's bedside. 27 years of anniversaries that broke him open every time. 27 years of visits to a grave in the dark, of questions with no answers, of a life he had nearly destroyed trying to survive grief that had nowhere to go. Now someone was telling him an arrest had been made. He said later that the emotion of that moment was almost impossible to put into words. 27 years compressed into a single phone call, every anniversary, every breakdown, every night at that grave when he had asked his mother for help and gotten only silence back, it had come. 27 years late. But it had finally come. Sheila was extradited to Florida, booked into Palm Beach County Jail, and charged with first-degree murder with a firearm. State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg stood before cameras and announced the prosecution would be seeking the death penalty. Sheila pleaded not guilty. Her defense attorney, Greg Rosenfeld, went to work immediately, calling the DNA evidence unreliable, pointing to mishandled evidence bags, arguing the entire case was built on decades-old material that had been contaminated and compromised beyond use. He said Sheila was innocent, said the state was desperate to close a notorious cold case and had fixed its sights on the wrong woman without ever letting the evidence lead elsewhere. Michael Warren issued a statement from Virginia. His wife had nothing to do with Marlene's murder. He stood completely behind her innocence. The investigation had never been fair. He said all the right things in all the right order. And then Sheila's booking photo was released. She was 61 years old. 27 years had passed since the morning she had walked away from Marlene Warren's porch. The death penalty was now on the table. In the booking photo, she was smiling. The same unbothered, direct expression she had worn in her teenage mugshot when she was first arrested at 17. Decades of living in between, a murder charge hanging over her head, the state seeking her execution. She smiled for the camera like it was a minor inconvenience. Sheila had pointed at Michael the moment the handcuffs snapped shut, but legally, the state only had a case against her. Now, a massive legal battle was preparing to begin in Palm Beach County. The defense was already sharpening every argument they had, ready to show a jury that 27 years of dust, missing files, and compromised evidence had rotted the foundation of the prosecution's case from the inside out. The trap had shut, but the cage wasn't locked yet. And as the courtroom doors prepared to open, one question sat at the center of everything. Could the ghost of 1990 truly survive a modern trial? Or was the killer clown about to walk away free after all this time with nothing left to stop her? The arrest felt like the end. It wasn't. For the next 5 years, Sheila Keene Warren sat in Palm Beach County Jail waiting for a trial that kept refusing to arrive. The case was postponed 6 times. 6 separate trial dates were set. 6 times something collapsed the timeline and pushed it further into the future. First, it was the sheer volume of evidence, decades of accumulated files, photographs, witness statements, forensic reports, and legal filings that both sides needed months to process. Then, COVID-19 shut the courts down entirely. Then, more delays. Then, more filings. Then, more arguments about what evidence would even be allowed in front of a jury. 5 years, in a jail cell, waiting. And while Sheila waited, the case against her was quietly coming apart at the seams. The evidence problems had started long before the arrest. But now, with the trial approaching, every flaw was being held under a microscope by a defense team that knew exactly what they were looking at. The evidence bags from the 1990 investigation were pulled out of storage. What the defense found was difficult to explain away. The bags were torn open, not slightly. Gaping holes wide enough for contamination to enter freely over decades of storage. One bag contained the comparison clown wig that investigators had purchased in 1990 to test against the fibers found in the LeBaron. The wig was partially sticking out of the open bag. Defense attorney Greg Rosenfeld held it up in court and described it accurately. Horrifying. This was the physical container holding the most critical fiber evidence in a first-degree murder case, and it had been sitting in a compromised storage area open to the environment for over 30 years. Defense argued it immediately. Cross-contamination, unreliable chain of custody, inadmissible. If those fibers had been exposed to outside material for decades, how could any jury be asked to trust what the lab found on them? Then something worse happened. One of the prosecution's key witnesses, the detective who had personally compiled and could walk a jury through the complete chain of custody for the fiber evidence, died before the trial began. Without him on the stand, prosecutors faced a devastating gap. They could present the fibers. They could not fully authenticate how every piece had been collected, stored, and preserved in an unbroken chain from 1990 to today. In criminal law, a broken chain of custody doesn't just weaken evidence, it can get it thrown out entirely. Then the costume store witnesses were ruled inadmissible. 2 employees from Spotlight Capezio who had identified Sheila from a photo lineup back in 1990, one of the clearest human connections between Sheila and the clown costume, were disqualified due to inconsistencies and conflicting accounts that had accumulated across multiple interviews over the decades. 30 years of time does that to memory. Details shift, stories evolve slightly, and a defense attorney with sharp eyes and the right questions can turn those small evolutions into reasonable doubt faster than most people expect. The prosecution was watching their case erode piece by piece. Every day that passed had made it harder. Witnesses died, memories faded, evidence aged, and the defense was using every single one of those years against them with surgical precision. 2 weeks before the trial was finally scheduled to begin, the prosecution made the call. On April 25, 2023, Sheila Keene Warren changed her plea. Not guilty became guilty. Not first-degree murder. Second-degree murder, a charge that carries no death penalty, no mandatory life sentence, and under Florida's 1990 sentencing guidelines, allowed for significant credit toward time already served. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison. She had already served over 5.5 years in Palm Beach County Jail while waiting for trial. Under Florida's gain time law, which calculates sentence reductions based on the law in effect at the time of the crime, not at the time of sentencing, her release date was not years away. It was approximately 16 months away. The prosecution explained their decision simply and honestly. They believed Sheila was guilty. They had always believed it. But the fear, the real, documented fear that lived inside that prosecutor's office was going to trial with compromised evidence and aging witnesses and losing. A not guilty verdict would mean double jeopardy. It would mean Sheila Keene Warren could never be tried for Marlene's murder again for as long as she lived. A guaranteed conviction on second-degree murder was worth more than a gamble on first-degree that might hand her complete freedom. They needed her guilty plea on record. They needed her to stand in open court and say, yes, I did this. And she did. The courtroom went still as Sheila Keene Warren answered the judge's question out loud, on the record, in front of everyone. Yes, I agree with that factual basis. 33 years after Marlene Warren opened her front door for the last time, the woman who had been standing on that porch finally admitted it in a court of law. Joey stood up to deliver his victim impact statement. He had waited 33 years for this moment. He had nearly destroyed himself waiting for it. He had sat at his mother's grave in the dark more times than he could count, talking to someone who couldn't answer, asking for something that felt like it would never come. Now he was standing in a Palm Beach County courtroom, looking at the woman who had taken his mother from him, and he said what he saw. I didn't see any remorse. Not an apology, not a break in the composure. Sheila sat through the sentencing the same way she had sat through everything, steady, controlled, expression giving nothing away. Joey said what needed to be said and sat down. State Attorney Dave Ehrenberg stepped to the microphone. His statement was short and precise. Sheila Keene Warren will always be an admitted convicted murderer and will wear that stain for every day for the rest of her life. Then Michael Warren released a statement from Virginia. He said his wife had not committed this crime, said it was difficult to watch her plead guilty to something she didn't do, and then he added the line that told everyone exactly how he had been calculating this situation from the very beginning. It wasn't worth the gamble when she was offered a deal that will have her home in 16 to 18 months. Her home, back with him. That was the math. That was always the math. On November 2nd, 24, Sheila Keene Warren walked out of a Florida prison 18 months after pleading guilty to the murder of Marlene Warren. 34 years after the morning she had put on an orange wig and white face paint and driven a stolen car to a house in Wellington. She was 61 years old and she was free. Michael Warren was waiting. They returned together to Kingsport, Tennessee, the same town where they had run the Purple Cow, where neighbors had known them as Mike and Debbie, where nobody had known about any of this for years. His defense attorney released a statement on his behalf after her release. We are absolutely thrilled that Ms. Keene Warren has been released from prison and is returning to her family. As we've stated from the beginning, she did not commit this crime. Michael Warren has never been charged with anything connected to Marlene's murder. He has never been arrested for it. He has never stood in a courtroom and answered for it. He is free, living his life in Tennessee right now, today as you watch this. The man who left for the racetrack that morning. The man every employee at Bargain Motors pointed to. The man whose own wife named him before she died. The man Sheila pointed at the moment she was arrested. Free. Joey went to his mother's grave after the plea. He stood there the way he had stood there so many times before, but this time it was different. This time he wasn't asking questions. This time he wasn't lost in the dark with nowhere to put the pain. He looked at that headstone and said what he had promised her 33 years ago in a hospital room when she was on life support and he was 21 years old and terrified. We did it, Mom. We finally got justice. Somewhere in Michigan, in a quiet room in Marlene's mother Shirley's home, there is still a painting on the wall. A clown, smiling, painted by a teenage girl named Marlene McKinnon, who loved clowns because they meant joy and color and innocence. She painted it with her own hands. She could not have known when she set that brush down what a clown would one day mean for the rest of her life. Shirley has kept it there all these years. She said once, I don't hate clowns, I just hate one. Marlene Warren opened that door with a smile on her face. She reached for the flowers. She thought someone had sent her something beautiful. Those were her last happy seconds. standing in the sunshine, in the safest neighborhood in America, holding carnations from a clown who had been planning this moment for months. The woman who pulled the trigger served 18 months and went home. The man who investigators believe sent her there never spent a single day in prison for it. And Marlene's son spent 33 years of his life, his 20s, his 30s, his 40s, climbing out of the wreckage that one Saturday morning created, rebuilding himself piece by piece, carrying a promise to a woman who deserved so much more than what justice was able to deliver. That is the part nobody tells you about true crime. The case closes, the documents get filed, the convicted murderer goes home, and the people left behind just keep living with it. Before you go, I want to ask you 3 things. First, Michael Warren has never been charged. The evidence pointed at him from the very first anonymous call on the afternoon of the murder. Do you think he should have faced trial, and why do you think prosecutors never went after him? Second, Sheila pleaded guilty, but her attorney still publicly says she is innocent. She admitted it in court to get a deal. Does a forced guilty plea feel like real justice to you, or does it feel like something else? Third, Joey said he found closure when Sheila pleaded guilty. But the man his mother specifically named is still free. Do you think Joey actually got justice, or just the closest thing to it that the system could offer? Leave your answers below. And if this story stayed with you, you already know what to do. On the night of October 11th, 1980, a 25-year-old mother vanished into the Kentucky dark. No blood, no body, no goodbye, just a woman who was there one moment and gone the next. And for over 20 years, the truth belonged to only one man, the man who drove off into the dark and never looked back. This is the story of Marlene Major, a young mother who loved her children more than anything in the world, a woman who knew she was in danger, a woman who tried to get out, and a woman whose murder would stay buried for 2 decades, until the little girl she left behind refused to let it stay that way. 26 years before that dark October night, in the winter of 1954, Helen Marlene Oakes was born in Lincoln County, Kentucky, one of 7 children raised by Billy and Lorraine Oakes. People who knew her said she was warm, bubbly, the kind of person who made everyone around her feel at ease. Around town, people just called her Blondie because of the long golden hair that fell straight down to her waist. She seemed like a girl who had everything ahead of her. And then, when she was just 16 years old, she met Bill Major. Bill was 26, 10 years older, dark-haired, sharp-eyed. His own father would later describe him as a natural charmer, someone who could talk the pants off anybody. But his father always added one thing after that. You couldn't believe a word he said. Marlene didn't know that yet. Bill was attentive. He called her. He showed up. He made a teenage girl feel like the most important person in the room, and within a few years, the two were married. They settled in Verona, Kentucky, a small trailer off the highway. Bill opened his own auto repair shop right off the interstate, called it B&B Automotive. The B&B stood for Bill and Blondie. They had a son named Donald, then a daughter named Lalana. Verona, 1980. It was the kind of place where you left your back door unlocked and trusted your neighbors completely. Everyone knew everyone. No one asked too many questions. And in a town that small, a happy-looking family in a roadside trailer raised absolutely no suspicion. That small-town trust became the perfect shield for a monster. By 1980, whatever warmth had once existed between Marlene and Bill was long gone. The marriage had been falling apart for years. They fought constantly, loud, ugly arguments that filled their small trailer and spilled into the night. Neighbors heard it. And one man, more than anyone else, had a front row seat to all of it. That man was Glenn St. Hilaire. In the spring of 1980, Glenn was a young welder driving from Ohio to Texas looking for work. He had French-Canadian roots, a beat-up camper van, and no plan whatsoever because somewhere on the highway near Verona, his engine died. He called the only auto shop nearby, B&B Automotive. Bill Major came out, fixed the van, and by the end of that evening, the two men were out getting beers together. Bill liked Glenn immediately. Before the night was over, he had offered Glenn a place to park his camper right on their property. No rush. Stay as long as you need. Glenn said yes. What started as a one-night stop turned into something no one expected. Glenn ate meals with the family. He helped around the property. The children took to him right away, and Marlene, who was starving for warmth in a marriage that had gone completely cold, found in Glenn someone she could actually trust. But then Bill started doing something strange. He began pushing the two of them together. He created situations where Marlene and Glenn were alone, without him. And then, on one particularly hot summer night, Bill crossed a line that made Glenn's skin crawl. He suggested that Glenn sleep in the bed with Marlene, not beside the bed, in it. The room was suffocating. Glenn refused, but the psychological chess match had already begun. It made no sense at the time, a husband practically handing his wife to another man. But investigators would later understand exactly what Bill was doing. He wanted Glenn close to Marlene. He wanted the affair to happen, because a wife wrapped up in a new relationship asked fewer questions about what was happening behind closed doors. And a man living on your property made for a very convenient suspect if anything ever went wrong. Over the following weeks, Marlene and Glenn did fall in love, quietly, desperately. The way it happens when two people find each other inside a nightmare. Marlene told Glenn things she had never told her own sisters. She trusted him completely. She even handed him a stack of her private diaries to keep safe. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was insurance. She told him plainly, "If I disappear, give these to the police. No drama, no tears. Just a calm, quiet instruction from a woman who had already thought through what her husband might do to her." She knew exactly what he was capable of. By October 1980, Marlene had made her decision. She was leaving Bill. She had told her sister. She had told Glenn. She had a plan, and she had proof of something so serious that she was certain no judge in Kentucky would ever rule in Bill's favor. But Bill found out. The night of October 11th started quietly and ended like a thunderclap. Glenn heard the fight from outside. He had heard them argue before, but this one was different, louder, more vicious. Something in the air felt wrong, like the pressure before a storm breaks. So he did what he always did. He walked to a nearby diner, sat down with a cup of coffee, and waited for things to cool down. He was gone for a couple of hours. When he came back, the trailer was in complete disarray. Drawers had been ripped open. Clothes were scattered across the floor. The house was completely silent. Marlene was gone. And then, from the shadows inside the trailer, Bill Major stepped out. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "She left," Bill said. "Took the kids and ran. I don't know where she went." Glenn wanted to believe him. The marriage was broken. Marlene wanted out. Maybe she had finally had enough. Maybe this was it. But the very next morning, Glenn was walking near a neighbor's house when he stopped dead in his tracks. Through the window, he saw Marlene's children. They were there, safe, with the neighbor. Bill hadn't lost them at all. He had quietly dropped them off himself. Before the argument had even finished, before Glenn had ever come back from the diner, he had lied, straight to Glenn's face, without a single crack in his voice. And in that moment, everything Glenn thought he knew flipped completely upside down. Because there was one thing he knew about Marlene with absolute certainty. One thing no argument, no matter how bad, could ever change. Marlene would never leave without her children. Not voluntarily. Not for any reason on earth. Which meant she hadn't run. Which meant something had happened to her. Hours later, Glenn St. Hilaire walked into the Boone County Police Station. He placed Marlene's diaries on the detective's desk, and he told the officer on duty that Bill Major had just murdered his wife. But Glenn didn't realize something in that moment. By walking into that station, he had just put a target on his own back. To the detectives, Glenn wasn't just a grieving friend with information. He was the boyfriend. And in a murder case with no body, no blood, no crime scene, the boyfriend is always the perfect suspect. The investigation was about to begin. But before it could go anywhere, detectives had a choice to make, and the wrong choice was going to let a killer walk free for the next 20 years. That same day, Bill Major walked into the station. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't red-eyed from crying. He came in calm, composed, and completely in control, the way a man walks in when he has already rehearsed everything he's going to say. His story was simple, clean, almost too clean. Marlene had been unhappy for a long time. The marriage was struggling. And then Glenn showed up and Marlene fell for him. Bill said he had even encouraged Marlene to spend time with Glenn, hoping it would pass. But it didn't. On the night of October 11th, Marlene had finally made her choice. She got into her car and drove away. Bill looked the detective in the eye and said he hadn't seen her since. 2 men, 2 rooms, 2 completely different realities, and in the middle, a frustrated detective with absolutely no physical evidence to prove who was lying. The case was dead on arrival, until they broke the seal on Marlene's diaries. The detective sat down and started reading. What he found wasn't a story about an affair. It wasn't the diary of a woman running away from her marriage. It was the diary of a woman living in silent terror. Marlene had written about what she saw one morning when she went to wake her son Donald for school. She walked into the room. And she caught Bill, right there compromising the safety of their 8-year-old boy. In her own words, she wrote, "I know what I saw. I told him never to touch again, and if he ever harms Donald again, I'll ensure he faces justice. She wrote that Donald had told her this had been happening for 4 to 5 years. 4 to 5 years. Donald was 8 years old. Marlene wasn't just leaving because the marriage was broken. She was leaving because she had witnessed her husband do something to her child that she could never unsee, never forgive, and never allow to continue. She had written down everything as evidence because she knew that in a divorce she would need proof. She wrote, "I could be the worst woman in Verona and no judge would dare give him my children before me." She was building a case, quietly, carefully, from inside the trap. And then the detective found something else buried deeper in the file, something that made the whole picture even darker. Bill Major had a 1975 conviction in a neighboring county for severe boundary violations against minors. It had been reduced to a misdemeanor. He had been ordered into counseling. And then the record quietly gathered dust. Marlene had found out. She had followed Bill to his court-ordered sessions without him knowing. She had pulled the court documents herself. She had written every detail down. She knew exactly who she had married. She had spent years quietly collecting the proof she needed to escape. And she had told her sisters what she knew, that Bill was dangerous, that she had evidence, that she was leaving. The detective closed the diary. He sat with what he had just read for a long moment. Then came the words that would haunt this case for the next 2 decades. "It's hearsay. We can't use it." In a court of law, a diary is one person's private account, written alone, with no witness, no cross-examination. What Marlene had written about what she saw, what Donald had told her, what Bill had done, none of it could anchor a murder charge. Even what she had told her sisters, her fears, her plans, her proof, was deemed inadmissible without a body to confirm a crime had even taken place. What she told her family, what she left in those pages, all of it hearsay. Without a body, there was no crime. The detectives had a diary full of motive. They had 2 men with contradicting stories. They had a missing woman with no car, no money, no ID, and no trace. Legally, their hands were tied, and Bill knew it. When detectives asked him to take a polygraph test, he didn't flinch. He simply refused. And within days, he began erasing his life in Kentucky completely. He handed his firearms to his neighbor Bryce for almost nothing. He sold his tractor. He quietly liquidated everything he had. Then he packed his children's things and put them on a plane to Rhode Island. He told them they were going to visit family. They never went home. A few days later, Bill arrived in Rhode Island without Marlene. Lalana was 4 years old. Donald was 8, and their father sat them down and gave them the only version of their mother they would know for the next decade. He told them she was a drug addict, an alcoholic, a woman who had chosen another man over her own children. He said she didn't love them, that she was never coming back. Lalana didn't fully understand what any of it meant, but she understood one thing. Her mother was gone, and the man sitting in front of her was all that was left. Back in Kentucky, the investigation slowed, then stalled, then stopped. The case went cold. Somewhere deep in the cold Kentucky soil, the truth was already buried. And the man who put it there had just walked away clean. He had crossed state lines. He was starting a new life, and he was now raising the only 2 eyewitnesses to his darkness. For 20 years, the file gathered dust. For 20 years, Bill's lie was the only truth his children knew. Until the 4-year-old girl he carried onto that plane grew up. Lalana Major was about to look into her mother's past, and she was ready to dig up everything her father had buried. Rhode Island looked nothing like Kentucky. Different streets, different skies, different neighbors who didn't know their names yet. For 4-year-old Lalana and 8-year-old Donald, everything was unfamiliar. The schools, the cold, the fast-talking strangers with accents that felt nothing like the slow drawl of Verona. But one thing had followed them across every state line. Their father, Bill, settled the family in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, bought a trailer, enrolled the kids in school, and within a year married a woman named Pauline. From the outside, it looked like a man rebuilding his life after a difficult divorce. A fresh start. A blended family trying to find its footing. That was the story Bill told the world. Inside that trailer, the story was something else entirely. The abuse didn't start slowly. It was already there, carried in like luggage from Kentucky, and it got worse with every passing month. Bill's rages were unpredictable. Calm one minute, explosive the next, for no reason anyone could see coming. The children learned to read the air in a room the moment they walked in. The way he was sitting, whether his jaw was tight, they learned to move quietly, speak carefully, and disappear when the temperature dropped. But disappearing wasn't always possible. Bill subjected Donald to such extreme physical rages on some occasions that the boy was left physically incapacitated on the floor. Lalana would go to school in long sleeves in the summer, not because she was cold, but because the bruises underneath couldn't be explained, and the physical violence was only the surface. Bill had a favorite method of control. He would pull one child aside and make it clear that any disobedience would mean severe, life-threatening consequences for their sibling. Then he would pull the other one aside and play the exact same psychological game in reverse. He turned their love for each other into a weapon. He made them complicit in their own silence, because speaking up didn't just mean danger for themselves. It meant putting the person they loved most directly in harm's way. They stayed quiet, because in the back of both their minds sat a thought neither of them ever said out loud. Their mother had disappeared. Their father was the last person who had seen her alive. If he could make a grown woman vanish without a trace, what would he do to a child who talked? Bill also had a system at work. He had parked a recreational vehicle on his employer's property, an RV tucked away from the main building, away from eyes and questions. Each day he would bring one child with him, and at some point during that day he would take them into that RV. To his coworkers, he was just a hard-working father who liked spending time with his kids. The RV looked like a lunch spot, a place to rest. It was the place where the worst things happened. Donald and Lalana never discussed it with each other directly. They didn't need to. They both knew. And that shared, unspoken knowledge became the invisible thread that held them together, warning glances across a room, hovering for each other's absences, making sure neither one was ever completely alone with him if they could help it. They were each other's only protection in a house where no real protection existed. Pauline was not a cruel woman. She was genuinely kind to the children, warmer than anyone else in their lives at that point. She noticed the bruises. She asked questions. She paid attention in ways that Bill worked constantly to prevent. And one day, Lalana broke. She wrote everything she could bring herself to put into words. The rages, the screaming, the violence that filled their nights, and left it on the kitchen table in a letter addressed to Pauline. Pauline read it, and then she did something no one in that house had ever done. She confronted Bill directly. Bill didn't get angry. He didn't threaten her. He collapsed, he sat down, and he cried. The kind of crying that makes a person look small and broken and harmless. He told Pauline he knew he had a problem. He promised her, hands shaking, voice cracking, that it would never happen again, that he would get help, that he was a changed man. Pauline believed him. She walked to the kitchen sink and burned the letter. She thought she was saving her family. He had no idea she was sealing them back inside the nightmare. The very next time Bill was alone with Lalana, he grabbed her. He pushed her against the wall. He brandished a weapon directly at her and looked her in the eyes with an expression she would describe years later as the coldest thing she had ever seen. "If you ever say anything to anyone again," he said, "you won't live to regret it." Lalana stood completely still. She didn't scream. She absorbed every word. And then she went silent for years. By 1984, Donald was 12 years old. He had been carrying this weight his entire life. And somewhere that year, something inside him reached its absolute limit. He had watched his sister get a gun pressed to her face for writing a letter about screaming and bruises. He knew that what Lalana had written was only the surface. He knew what was really happening. Inside that trailer, inside that RV at work, in every hidden corner of their lives, he went to Pauline. Not with a letter about bad tempers, not with carefully chosen words designed to soften the blow. He told her the full, unspoken truth. The truth about what his father was doing to him inside that RV. The truth that went far beyond rages and bruises. This time, Pauline didn't cry. She didn't sit down with Bill. She didn't give him a chance to speak. She walked straight to the phone and called the police. August 10th, 1984. Police cars pulled up to the house with lights flashing. Officers moved quickly. Bill Major was inside, and within minutes he was against the wall with his hands being pulled behind his back. Lalana and Donald stood at the end of the hallway and watched. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Bill turned his head. He looked directly down that hallway at his children. His face was completely still. No anger, no panic, no expression at all. Just a long, cold, deliberate stare. Lalana felt her stomach drop, because she had seen that look before. It wasn't the face of a man who had been caught. It was the face of a man making a promise. If he gets out, she thought, we're dead. Bill Major was sentenced to 15 years in a Rhode Island state prison. Donald and Lalana were sent back to Kentucky, to Verona, to the home of their maternal grandmother, Lorraine Oakes, Marlene's mother. For the first time in their lives, they were safe. But safety has a way of making room for the questions that fear had always pushed aside. Lalana was 9 years old, sitting in a house full of people who finally loved her, and all she could think about was her mother, not the version her father had described, not the drug addict who didn't love her children, the real one, the one from before, the one with the long golden hair. And the question that had been growing quietly inside her since she was 4 years old was finally loud enough to hear. If my father could do all of this, for years, without anyone stopping him, what exactly did he do to her that night? That question was about to take over Lalana's entire life, and the answer she was going to find, buried in a cold case file that hadn't been touched in over a decade, was going to be worse than anything she had imagined. If you're standing with Lalana on this journey to uncover the truth, take a moment to subscribe and support this channel. Because what comes next is the part that changes everything. Nobody said her name. That was the thing Lalana noticed first. Back in Verona, in her grandmother Lorraine's house, surrounded by family for the first time in years, nobody said Marlene's name. There was a photograph on the living room wall, a young woman with short, curly hair. Lalana stared at it for days before she realized who it was. She didn't recognize her own mother. The Marlene she remembered had long golden hair that fell straight down to her waist. The woman in that photograph was someone else entirely. Someone who had existed before Lalana was old enough to remember. Someone the adults in the house carried quietly, like a wound that never closed, present in every room, mentioned in none. At school, kids knew. Small towns always know. Lalana was the girl whose mother had run away, left her kids, chose a man over her own family. That was the story Bill had planted, and it had grown roots even here, even in Marlene's own hometown. Lalana sat in classrooms and hallways and absorbed the whispers, and every time someone repeated her father's version of events, something hardened inside her. She didn't believe it. She had never believed it. But belief without proof is just stubbornness. The countdown started the moment Bill was sentenced. 15 years. That was what the Rhode Island court had given him. 15 years, which meant he would be out before Lalana finished growing up. She did the math constantly, the way children do when they're afraid. She tracked the years like a prisoner tracks days. Every birthday that passed was 1 year closer to the moment Bill Major walked back out into the world. And she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had looked into his eyes in that hallway, that when he got out, he would come looking for them. The only thing that could stop that from happening was the truth about Marlene. If Bill could be charged with murder, he would never be free again. But to charge him with murder, someone had to prove one had taken place. And the only person who seemed willing to do that work was a teenage girl in her grandmother's house in Verona, Kentucky, with no legal training, no resources, and no allies. So she bought a composition notebook, 99 cents at Walmart, and she started writing everything down. Every conversation she had, every name she heard, every date she could remember. She interviewed neighbors, family members, anyone who had known Marlene. She wrote down the time and date of every single conversation. She documented everything because she had watched the system ignore her mother once already, and she was not going to give it a reason to ignore her again. In 1996, the countdown ended. Bill Major walked out of prison after serving 11 years of his 15-year sentence. A stroke in 1995 had accelerated his release on medical grounds. He was a free man. Lalana was 20 years old, and she was terrified. Not the paralyzing fear of childhood, but a cold, focused kind of terror that made her move faster instead of freezing. Because Bill being free meant the window was closing. It meant that if something wasn't done soon, he would disappear into a new life, a new state, a new wife, a new identity, and Marlene's case would never be touched again. Lalana picked up the phone and called her father. She made him an offer. She told him she wasn't interested in prosecution. She said she just wanted to bury her mother. That was all. Just tell her where the body was, and she would leave him alone. She would let him live his life, she promised. Bill listened to the whole thing, and then he laughed, not nervously, not uncomfortably. He laughed the way someone laughs when they hear a joke that isn't very good. Then he said, "If you think I'm going to tell you where your mother's body is, you're crazy." Lalana didn't say much after that. She hung up the phone, and she sat with what had just happened for a long moment. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't said, "There is no body." He hadn't said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He had answered a question about a body's location, which meant he knew exactly where it was. Lalana opened her composition notebook and wrote the date at the top of a new page. Okay, she thought. It's on. She went to the Boone County Sheriff's Department and asked for the case file on Marlene Major. The response she got was a masterclass in institutional indifference. The case was old. The files might be archived. It had been classified as a missing person case, not a homicide. There was no active investigation. Come back later. Call this number. Fill out this form. Lalana came back. She called. She filled out the forms. She showed up again and again, became the person the front desk recognized, the young woman with the notebook who kept asking about the same cold case from 1980. Some officers were dismissive, some were annoyed. A few were quietly impressed by her persistence even if they didn't say so. Eventually, after enough time and enough returned visits, the file appeared. It was thinner than she expected. Yellowed pages, faded ink, evidence of a case that had been opened, poked at briefly, and then quietly set aside. Lalana sat down with it and started reading, and within the first few pages, she understood something that made her stomach turn. The 1980 investigation had been shallow. Police had accepted Bill's story about Marlene leaving far too easily. The search of the property had been cursory. The diary, the one Glenn had handed over on day one, had been catalogued, deemed legally insufficient, and shelved within days. Nobody had pushed back. Nobody had asked the harder questions. And Bill had walked away from Kentucky within a week of his wife's disappearance because nobody had stopped him. But then Lalana turned to a section near the back of the file that she hadn't known existed. November 29th, 1981. Hunter on a farm approximately 1 mile from the major property had found a partial human skull. Female, Caucasian, late 20s, with clear signs of trauma to the upper structure. The remains had been heavily altered. Crucial identifying features and dental records were entirely missing from the skull. Lalana sat completely still. She read the page again and again. The skull had been sent to a lab. It had sat there, unidentified, unclaimed, untested, for nearly 2 decades. Because in 1981, without teeth and without DNA technology, there was no way to confirm who it belonged to. But Marlene had a daughter, and daughters share their mother's DNA. There was one piece of evidence that had been sitting in that lab since 1981, forgotten, dusty, waiting, and it had been less than a mile from where Marlene was last seen alive. Lalana closed the file. Her hands were not shaking. Her voice, if she had spoken, would have been steady. She had just found the thread that was going to unravel everything. Now she had to pull it. Lalana walked out of that sheriff's department with the file under her arm, and one thought locked in her mind. That skull was her mother. She couldn't prove it yet. But she knew, the way you know things that live in your body before they live in your head. A partial skull, female, late 20s. Found 1 mile from the house where Marlene Major was last seen alive. Jawless, toothless, with a bullet hole in the top. The person who had done that to the remains, who had taken the time to systematically erase any dental records or structural identifiers, had done it for one reason. It had worked for 20 years. Lalana was about to try to make it stop working. She started researching, reading, asking questions of anyone who would answer them, and somewhere in that process, she came across something that had only recently become possible in forensic science: mitochondrial DNA testing. The science is straightforward once you understand it. Inside every human cell are tiny structures called mitochondria. They carry their own separate strand of DNA. And unlike regular DNA, which comes from both parents, mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child, unchanged, direct, generation to generation, which meant that if that skull belonged to Marlene Major, its mitochondrial DNA would match Lalana's. All it required was a bone sample from the skull and a swab from the inside of Lalana's cheek. The problem was the cost. $20,000. For a family in Verona, Kentucky, that was not a number you simply found lying around. Lalana started making calls to family members, to anyone who might be willing to contribute. Marlene's sister stepped forward and offered something that stopped everyone in the room. She said she would cash out her retirement fund, her entire retirement. Every dollar she had saved over decades of working, she would hand it over to test a skull. That is what this family was willing to sacrifice for Marlene. It never came to that. At the last possible moment, the state of Kentucky agreed to cover the cost. The test would be funded, the sample would be taken, and after 20 years of silence, the skull in that forensic lab was finally going to have a chance to speak. But before the DNA results could mean anything, the skull needed to be formally examined. That job went to forensic anthropologist Dr. Emily Craig. Craig laid out the remains and went through them with the kind of careful, methodical attention that turns bone fragments into evidence. What she found was not just a cause of death, it was a record of deliberate, calculated violence. There was evidence of catastrophic trauma. The analysis indicated that Marlene had sustained fatal injuries from a firearm at close range, with multiple impacts confirming an intentional act. But the gunshot was only the beginning. Along the neck bones, Dr. Conshot, Craig found a series of straight, parallel marks, evenly spaced, running in a clean horizontal line. The markings indicated the use of a sharp, heavy tool. It was clear evidence of a calculated attempt to permanently compromise and conceal the remains. And then there was the jaw. The structural damage to the remains was highly specific. Dr. Craig found fine, precise markings along the bone joints. These markings were left by a sharp blade used intentionally to dismantle the structure of the skull. The individual responsible knew exactly how to navigate the anatomy, working methodically until the features were completely separated. This was not the work of someone who had lost control. This was the work of someone who had planned. Dr. Craig's conclusion was unambiguous. The manner of death was homicide. Then the DNA results came back. The lab called. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from the skull's bone tissue was compared against the sample taken from Lalana. The result was a maternal match. The skull belonged to a direct maternal relative of Lalana Bramble. It was Marlene. Lalana got the call and sat with it for a long time. Later, she would describe that moment in 3 words. 110% she's gone. No hope, no coming back, no chance that somewhere out there Marlene had made a new life and simply chosen not to return. The last small corner of uncertainty, the one Lalana had probably never fully admitted, was still there, closed permanently. Her mother had been murdered. And now the state of Kentucky had the evidence to prove it. Marlene Major's case was officially reclassified, no longer a missing person, no longer a cold case, a homicide. Commonwealth attorney Linda Talley-Smith had been watching Lalana's persistence for years. When the DNA result came through, she didn't hesitate. She assigned her best cold case investigator, Detective Todd Kenner, to the case full-time. Kenner looked at what they had. A confirmed murder, a skull with forensic evidence of a violent, premeditated death, a victim whose own diary had named the only person with a motive, and a primary suspect who had been living freely for years. It was a strong foundation. But foundation alone doesn't convict anyone. They needed something that would hold up in front of a jury, a direct link between Bill Major and the murder of his wife. Physical evidence was gone. No body, no car, no weapon. The diary was still inadmissible hearsay. And then Detective Kenner found out about the phone call. In 1996, while Bill was being held in Boone County Jail on the Kentucky child molestation charges, he had made a phone call to his father, James Major, and during that call, Bill had confessed. According to James, Bill told him everything, that he had killed Marlene, that he had shot her, that he had disposed of her body and her car. James Major, a retired trucker who had spent years quietly carrying what his son had told him, had gone to investigators as soon as he found out the case was being reopened. He was done protecting a secret he had never wanted to carry. He sat across from detectives and told them exactly what his son had said. Kenner leaned forward. This was it. A direct confession from the killer's own mouth, reported by the killer's own father. Then came the problem. Boone County Jail recorded inmate phone calls. But for reasons that investigators could never fully explain, that particular call, that specific conversation in 1996, had not been recorded. There was no tape, no transcript, no audio. Nothing but an old man's memory of a conversation that had happened years ago, and James Major, despite his willingness to cooperate, was not a neutral witness. There was serious, documented hostility between him and Bill. Any defense attorney worth their fee would tear that testimony apart in front of a jury. An unrecorded confession reported by an estranged father who despised his son. It wasn't enough. Not alone. Bill had confessed. His own father had heard every word. But without a recording, it meant nothing in a court of law. They had one shot left, and it required James Major to do something that took more courage than most people will ever be asked to show. They needed him to call his son again, this time with a wire. Detective Kenner had one move left, and it depended entirely on a retired trucker living in Nova Scotia, Canada, a man in his 70s who hated his son with every fiber of his being and had been waiting years for someone to finally ask him for help. Kenner and Detective Tim Carnahan packed their bags and flew to Nova Scotia. James Major met them at his home. He was cooperative from the first conversation. No hesitation, no conditions. He had already told investigators what Bill had confessed to him in 1996. He already knew that confession couldn't be used, and when detectives explained what they needed him to do, call his son again with a recording device on the phone and get him talking, James didn't flinch. He agreed immediately. He even suggested his own cover story. He would tell Bill he didn't have long to live, that he was sick, that he was calling because he needed to settle things before he died. It was the kind of story that might lower Bill's guard, make him feel like the conversation was private, emotional, final. Detectives set up the recording equipment. James picked up the phone, and they waited to see if 20 years of silence was finally about to break. Bill answered. The first few minutes were careful, measured. Bill was pleasant on the surface, the way charming people are when they haven't yet decided whether to trust a situation. And then, almost immediately, he said it. "Why do I get the feeling that somebody's trying to set me up?" The room went still. Kenner didn't move. James stayed calm. He pushed back gently, told Bill he was overthinking it, said he was just an old man who wanted to talk to his son, that Lilana kept calling him, asking about Marlene, and he didn't know what to tell her anymore. Bill was quiet for a moment. Then he kept talking. James steered the conversation carefully. He told Bill that Lilana just wanted to know where her mother was. She wanted to be able to put Marlene's bones in a casket and have a proper burial. That was all. Just closure for a daughter who had spent her whole life not knowing. Bill's response came without a pause. "Yeah, and put me in jail for life." In the room with the recording equipment, Kenner looked at Carnahan. There it was. Not a denial. Not, "I don't know what happened to Marlene." Not, "I had nothing to do with it." Bill had just responded to the question of his wife's burial location by calculating his own prison sentence. The logic of a guilty man, spoken out loud, on tape, without realizing what he had just handed them. James kept going. He pushed gently on the edges of what Bill had told him in 1996. He referenced the confession without naming it directly. He told Bill that at the very least he could be decent enough to say where he had left her. Bill's answers stayed evasive, but they stayed revealing. "And then she's going to bounce it right back on me again. Then I'll have them Kentucky cops coming up here to arrest me." He was negotiating the consequences of telling the truth, which meant he knew the truth, which meant there was a truth to know. James tried another angle. "You have pulled off the perfect crime, haven't you?" Bill paused. "No, I wouldn't call it perfect." "No? If the crime was perfect, nobody would ever know about it." James let that sit for a moment. Then he asked the only question that really mattered. "Don't you even feel bad for killing her?" The answer came back flat, empty, with no more emotion than someone answering a question about the weather. "I don't have any kind of conscience about anything." Kenner exhaled slowly. That was it. That was the line. Not a technical confession, not "I killed her on this date with this weapon," but something in some ways more damning. A man who had just been asked if he felt remorse for killing his wife and had answered with a calm, almost bored admission that he felt nothing, about anything. Kenner looked at Carnahan. "We got him." The arrest came on June 25, 2001. Detectives flew to Fairhaven, Massachusetts, where Bill had been living with his third wife, a woman named Claire Bailey, a bus monitor who believed her husband had gone to prison years ago for armed robbery. She had no idea who she had married. Officers knocked on the door of the house in Fairhaven. Bill Major, now 57 years old, opened it. He was served with an arrest warrant for the first-degree murder of Helen Marlene Major, a crime committed 21 years earlier in a small Kentucky town that he thought he had left behind forever. He was handcuffed on his own doorstep. And then something unexpected happened. On the drive back to Kentucky, hours in the back of a police car, crossing state lines, heading toward the place where everything had started, Bill Major started talking. Nobody asked him to. Nobody pushed. He simply began, as if something had loosened inside him now that the pretense was finally over. He told detectives his version of the night of October 11th, 1980. He said they had been arguing in Marlene's car, her 1972 Ford Pinto, parked outside the trailer. The fight had escalated, voices rising, the air inside the car getting tighter. Marlene told him she was leaving, that she was taking the children, that if he didn't sign the divorce papers and let her go, she was going to tell everyone, his family, the courts, anyone who would listen, exactly what he had been doing to Donald. Bill said she pulled a gun on him. He said he took it away from her, and then she started screaming, loud, uncontrolled, the kind of screaming that meant everything was coming apart, and he said that was when he lost it. He fired until the gun was empty. 6 shots, 4 in the torso, 2 in the face, and then, and this is the part that detectives noted carefully in their reports, Bill told them he was proud of his grouping, all 6 bullet holes within a 10-inch diameter. He described it like a man talking about a target at a shooting range, tight, controlled, precise. He had just murdered his wife, and his first thought was pride. After the shooting, he left Marlene's body in the Pinto. He drove to the neighbor's house, Trini Bryce, and dropped off the children, told them he'd be back in a few hours. Then he returned to the car. He drove the Pinto to the Waller farm, a property where he had worked occasionally, land he knew well, land with a sinkhole deep enough to swallow a body. He carried Marlene there. He placed her in the sinkhole. He covered it with dirt. Then he took a piece of rolled fencing from the property and laid it over the top. He tossed the murder weapon into a nearby pond. Then he drove the Pinto to the Ohio River and pushed it in. The car went under. The crime scene went with it. He went home, woke his children, and told them their mother had run away. Investigators searched the Waller farm. They searched the pond. They searched the stretch of the Ohio River where the Pinto had gone in. They used boats. They used an airplane to scan the water from above. They found nothing. No car, no weapon, no remaining bones. The only piece of Marlene Major that had ever surfaced was the skull found by a hunter in 1981, and even that had taken 20 years of science catching up to identify. But they didn't need the car. They didn't need the weapon. They had the DNA. They had the forensic evidence of homicide. They had the recorded phone call. And now they had a confession, spoken freely in the back of a police car by a man who told them he felt no remorse. For the first time in 21 years, the state of Kentucky had everything it needed. William Alexander Major was going to trial, and two children who had spent their entire lives being told their mother had abandoned them were finally going to get the chance to tell the truth. July 2003, Boone Circuit Court, Burlington, Kentucky. 23 years after Marlene Major vanished into the dark, the man who put her there was finally sitting in a courtroom. He looked nothing like the man in the old photographs. The dark hair was gone. The sharp eyes were sunken. Bill Major was 59 years old, and he looked older than that, weathered in the specific way that guilt and prison and a 1995 stroke will weather a person. He arrived in a wheelchair. His defense team had made sure of that. A sick old man in a wheelchair reads differently to a jury than a calculated killer who had spent 2 decades living freely while his children carried the wreckage he had made of their lives. But Lalana knew exactly who was sitting in that chair. He had known since she was 4 years old. The prosecution built the case piece by piece. The jury heard about the night of October 11, 1980, the argument, the Ford Pinto, the 6 shots fired in the dark. They heard the forensic testimony of Dr. Gring, Emily Craig, who walked them through every cut mark on that skull, every deliberate incision, every sign of a killer who had worked methodically to make his wife unidentifiable. They heard the recorded phone call. Bill's own voice, flat and unbothered, telling his father he had no conscience about anything. They heard from Glenn St. Hilaire, who told the court that Bill had not just encouraged the affair, he had engineered it, had manufactured every situation that pushed Glenn and Marlene together, and Glenn told them something else, something he had never forgotten. Bill had told him directly, before Marlene disappeared, that if she ever tried to leave and take the children, he would shoot her, cut off her head, and knock out her teeth so no one could ever identify her body. Had described his plan out loud, to another person, before he carried it out. That is not a man who lost control in a moment of passion. That is a man who had already decided. Then Donald took the stand. He was 30 years old. He had spent more than 2 decades trying to build a life from the ruins of the one his father had created. He sat in that witness box and told the court what Bill had done to him. In the trailer, in the truck, in the warehouse, at work, wherever. He said those words plainly, without drama, without looking away. Then Lalana took the stand. She told the jury about the gun pressed to her face, about the threat that had kept her silent for years. About the morning she read her mother's diary for the first time and understood that Marlene had known everything, had been fighting to protect her children while quietly documenting every piece of evidence she would need to escape. The courtroom was very quiet while Lalana spoke. The defense had one argument. Bill's attorney, Edward Drennan, told the jury that the 1995 stroke had affected Bill's memory and judgment, that the confession in the police car was the confused rambling of a brain-damaged man, not a reliable account. He argued that whatever happened between Bill and Marlene that night was driven by emotional distress, that Bill had been pushed to a breaking point by jealousy and a crumbling marriage. Extreme emotional distress, that was the phrase. The same man who had told a friend exactly how he would destroy his wife's body before he did it. The same man who, when asked if he felt bad for killing her, had said he had no conscience about anything. That man, his attorney argued, had simply been under too much emotional pressure. After Drennan finished his closing argument, Bill leaned over and complimented him on a job well done. Then he turned his wheelchair to face the gallery, and he smiled at his children, not with warmth, not with regret, with the same cold, deliberate expression Lalana had seen in that Rhode Island hallway 19 years earlier. The smile of a man who still believed he was in control. He was wrong. The jury left to deliberate. Lalana and Donald sat in the gallery and waited. Every minute stretched. Every sound from the hallway made them look up. 43 minutes later, the jury came back. 43 minutes. For a murder committed in 1980. For a case that had been cold for 2 decades. For a woman who had been reduced to a single partial skull in a forensic lab while her killer raised her children and built new lives and smiled at people who had no idea who he really was. 43 minutes. The verdict was read aloud. Guilty. Donald leaned over to his sister and said 4 words. It's finally over. Lalana felt her brother's hand on her arm, and she nearly collapsed. Not from grief, from the weight of everything that had finally been set down. 20 years of notebooks and phone calls and closed doors, and a father who had laughed at her. 20 years of being the daughter of a woman everyone said had abandoned her family. All of it, in 43 minutes, had been overturned. She stood up in that courtroom and said goodbye to her father. Goodbye, Dad. I hope you spend the rest of your life behind bars. You deserve it. Bill was sentenced to life in prison and transported to Kentucky State Reformatory in LaGrange. But he wasn't done fighting. In 2005, he filed an appeal and won a retrial. His legal team argued on multiple grounds: the admissibility of the recorded call, the introduction of his prior crimes, prosecutorial conduct. The Kentucky Supreme Court granted the retrial. The second jury deliberated and came back with the same verdict. Guilty. Same sentence. Life. In 2009, Bill filed a second appeal. The court reviewed his arguments and denied it. Every door he tried to open stayed shut. William Alexander Major, the man who had told his children their mother was a drug addict, who didn't love them, who had pressed a gun to his daughter's face to buy her silence, who had smiled from a wheelchair at the children he had broken, was going to die in a Kentucky prison. And on October 15, 2017, that is exactly what happened. Bill Major died in custody at the age of 73. No obituary, no public mourning, no record of anyone marking his passing with anything other than relief. Marlene was buried. Not all of her, the rest of her remains were never found. The Waller Farm sinkhole gave nothing back. The Ohio River kept the Pinto. The pond held the gun. But the skull that had sat in a forensic lab for 20 years, identified finally by the DNA of the daughter who refused to give up, that was laid to rest. Marlene's mother, Lorraine, stood at the graveside and later told a reporter what those 20 years had felt like. You just couldn't believe how hard it was for us to know our daughter's skull was sitting in a forensic lab somewhere for all those years. The headstone reads Marlene Oakes, her maiden name, the name she was born with. The name she had before Bill Major entered her life when she was 16 years old and slowly dismantled everything she was. Here is what is true about Marlene Major. She was not a drug addict. She was not an alcoholic. She was not a woman who walked away from her children. She was a 25-year-old mother who discovered something horrifying happening inside her own home and made the decision to stop it. She gathered her evidence quietly. She made her plan carefully. She told the people she trusted. She was ready to leave. And Bill knew it. He killed her not in a moment of uncontrolled rage. He killed her because she was about to expose him, because she was smarter than he had counted on, because she had spent months building a case against him from the inside, and he had run out of time to stop her any other way. She died protecting her children. She died so that Donald and Lalana would have a chance at a life away from the man who had been destroying them both. She was right about one thing she wrote in that diary. No judge would have given Bill custody of those children once the truth came out. The truth did come out. It just took 23 years. And it took a daughter who bought a 99-cent notebook and refused, through fear and silence and dead ends, and a father who laughed at her, to stop writing in it. Marlene Oakes was buried on a September afternoon, 23 years after the night she disappeared. She was finally at peace, and the little girl she died trying to protect had made sure of it. Before you go, I want to ask you 3 things. If Marlene had lived and escaped that night, how different would the lives of her children have been? Lalana spent years fighting for justice with nothing but a 99-cent notebook. What does that tell you about what one person can accomplish when they simply refuse to quit? And finally, do you think Bill Major ever truly understood what he had taken from the world? Or did he go to his grave believing he had won? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one.